Chapter 251. By the time the sword spirit finished inscribing the first two sword arrays, without Lu Xiaoyi's supervision, it fell into a state of seclusion. It seemed that inscribing sword arrays was equally stressful for it. On the third night, the Four Seasons sword spirits carved an identical wind-type speed sword formation on the third level of the sword formation. It was almost identical to the first level. On the fourth layer, it was another simple earth attribute sword array. At this point, Lu Xiaoyi had a rough idea of what the Four Seasons sword spirit was thinking. It was using the two sword arrays as a foundation to inscribe alternately. Thinking about the sword spirit's thinking, it seemed to make a lot of sense. There was no need to talk about the wind attribute sword array. To a flying sword, nothing was more important than speed. As for the earth attribute sword array, it was probably the most suitable material for this sword embryo. Because when he bought this sword embryo, the shop owner had said that the sword embryo's greatest characteristic was its inertia. It was not restricted by its element, and was not afraid of fire, cold, water, or metal. Then, for a sword embryo made of such a material, the sword spirit born would naturally be close to inertia, which was the earth attribute. He understood a little now. The preference of a sword spirit after birth was closely related to the sword embryo. A fire attribute sword embryo would give birth to a sword spirit that was of the fire attribute. It was impossible for it to give birth to an ice attribute sword spirit. Since he knew the general direction of the engraving process, the rest was very simple. He went to the market of Thousand Elegance Peak and changed all the materials of the other attributes to these few materials. He wanted to see just how far the Four Seasons sword spirit could go with this engraving process. 10 days later, the Four Seasons sword spirit finally sent a message that it was exhausted. Unless it continued to grow stronger in the years to come, the sword array's layers would be its limit. Lu Xiaoyi suppressed his excitement and held the flying sword in his hand. This was an 8-layered flying sword, with 4 layers of wind element speed and 4 layers of earth element. They covered the sword alternately and were integrated as one. Because he had participated in the entire process, he, the sword spirit, and the flying sword had established a family-like relationship. This was a real flying sword. In the original choice of the Four Seasons sword formation, he had abandoned the metal and fire sword formations, and only kept the wood and earth sword formations. It could be said that he had maximized the simplicity of the sword formation. Or to put it another way, the sword spirit born from the inert sword embryo did not like the metal and fire sword formations. This was in line with its nature. Just because there's wind doesn't mean that it'll be compatible with fire. The powers of the 5 elements each had their own specialties. For example, the sharpness of metal, the wound of fire, the softness of water, the vitality of wood, and the laziness of earth. In terms of penetrating power, of course, metal was slightly better. The other 4 elements were slightly weaker, but they each had their own specialties. For example, fire elemental flying swords would have a unique fire elemental burning power, while Lu Xiaoyi's Four Seasons flying swords were earth elemental. The advantage was that they had a great resistance to other elemental attributes. In a battle between swordsmen, this wasn't obvious, because swordsman's nature in the foundation establishment stage was to pursue strength and speed. In terms of attributes, they were only dependent on the sword formation. But against a spell cultivator, a purely inert flying sword was too useful. Spell cultivators were naturally proficient in spells. In view of the arrogance of the sword vein on the 5 rings, preparing a few corrosive spells that specifically targeted flying swords was standard equipment in a spell cultivator's arsenal. This kind of countermeasure was useless against the inner swords, but it made the outer swords especially uncomfortable. If they really met a powerful spell cultivator, the outer swordsman wouldn't be willing to use his sword, because using the sword would mean the destruction of the flying sword. This was the value of an earth elemental flying sword. It wasn't afraid of the opponent's corrosive filth, and with the sword's spirit's recovery and repair, it meant that no matter the environment, he would dare to use his sword. This was very important to the outer swords. Lu Xiaoyi didn't do it deliberately, but with all kinds of coincidences, he naturally achieved his goal. He didn't know if it was because he swallowed the two cultivators' balls of fortune, but his luck was slowly changing. The important thing was that after the 4 seasons sword spirit's modification, the 4 seasons flying sword's speed and power had a fundamental increase. Previously, the power of his sword was only the combined power of an immature sword spirit and a trashy 5-layer sword formation, which was the power of an ordinary outer swordsman. He could only win by relying on his outer swords. But now, the power of the sword formation alone had reached the average standard of an ordinary outer sword, and with the addition of the sword spirit. If he faced Yun now, he could no longer ignore the power of his sword. Most of the 10 swords in a breath would have to be used for defense, and the number of swords that could be used to attack him would be limited. This was the essence of a sword battle. It was a complicated combination project. The combination of earth and wind? It made Lu Xiaoyi think of the endless yellow sands of the Gobi Desert. This was the will of the heavens, it made one sigh. The 4 seasons flying sword no longer lived up to its name. There were no 4 seasons, only wind and sand season. What made him most satisfied was that this wasn't the limit of the flying sword. It could actually grow, including the growth of the sword spirit. After the sword spirit grew, it could in turn carve more sword formations. 11 years after he entered Xianyuan, he finally had a flying sword with his own unique personality. Maybe now, he could become a real swordsman, an outer swordsman. Lu Xiaoyi didn't immediately order the sword spirit of Zhu City to carve sword formations. He already had some experience in using the sword spirit. In his opinion, he needed to set aside a few years to get along with the sword spirit and deepen their mutual understanding. He also needed to give the sword spirit of Zhu City a period of time to fully understand the strengths and weaknesses of the 10 charges of Zhu City sword technique. It would be best if he could go through some battles. Only in this way could the sword spirit slowly explore the most suitable sword formation for himself through practice. Only then could he display the flying sword's advantages to the extreme. He began to wonder if it was time to cultivate a 3rd sword spirit. This was a necessary procedure to strengthen oneself. One flying sword had to be at its peak, one had to be at the stage of deep communication with the sword spirit, and one flying sword had to be ready to slash someone and give birth to a sword spirit. He realized that there were more and more things to do. Cultivation had long surpassed what he had once thought. Just to live for a few hundred more years, there was always some involuntary push that pushed you forward. When you didn't have enough to eat, you only had one pain. When you were full, you would have endless pain. This was his current state. Regarding the new flying sword and sword technique, there was a principle. He had to be like the 4 seasons and Zhu City sword. He had to carve several layers of sword formations on the flying sword. The purpose of this was to let the sword spirit familiarize with the essence of the sword technique. Only then could he make the appropriate changes. If it was a bare flying sword, even if there was a chance to use it to slash someone and give birth to a sword spirit, the sword spirit itself wouldn't have the knowledge of a sword spirit. All of its knowledge came from the sword formations that had already been carved. This was a process that couldn't be omitted. It also meant that a large amount of resources would be invested. Although he had a headache, Lu Xiaoyi still chose from the 2 remaining sword embryos. Gu Bei's collection was of high quality. This was his life's work. Lu Xiaoyi didn't want to buy another sword embryo. His spirit stones were a little tight now. It was better to make a decision from what he had. Chapter 252. Of the 2 sword embryos, one was made with yang fire crystal as the main material. Needless to say, if he wanted to choose a sword art, he had to choose a fire attribute sword art. The other sword embryo was made with the rare nether passage jade and nether refined gold. It was a special sword embryo made with only one purpose: sneak attacks. Lu Xiaoyi considered the flying swords he already had. The 4 seasons was of the earth attribute, so it was not afraid of elemental attacks. The Ju Qing was of the pure strength attribute, so it had a powerful frontal assault ability. Then, he actually didn't want to refine a flying sword of the 5 elements. The 5 elements were good things, they were the foundation of all things. But the prerequisite was that you had to have all 5 elements, and be able to freely switch between them. Being biased towards only one element could give a cultivator the greatest advantage in certain aspects, but it was also very easy to be targeted. For example, if you cultivated a fire attribute flying sword to the extreme, then your opponent would be able to easily find a way to deal with you. For foundation establishment cultivators, they could only use the power of the 5 elements to a limited extent, and that was with the help of sword arrays. In reality, they knew very little about the basic principles of the 5 elements, and it was impossible for them to switch between the 5 elements. So, cultivating a flying sword of a single attribute was very limited. Unless their cultivation reached a certain level, they would be able to attach different elemental powers to their flying swords according to their opponents. After thinking so much, perhaps it was only because he liked sneak attacks more. Sneak attacks did not only refer to quietly approaching and catching the opponent off guard. Instead, it referred to the choice of tactics in battle, when other flying swords attracted the opponent's attention. Lu Xiaoyi felt that with such a hidden sword for sneak attacks, it would greatly enrich his tactical system. There was no right or wrong in tactical systems. The key was the understanding and preference of a person towards battle. How to maximize one's advantages and hide one's disadvantages well. This was talent, an intuition that could not be learned. People who were good at fighting would have very smart tactical systems. Hidden fragrance, 10 layers of sword arrays, was the sword art he had prepared for this sword embryo. It was also his last sword art limit. If he wanted to choose another sword art, he would have to wait for nearly 10 years. The current Lu Xiaoyi already looked like he was carrying a sword case. At the very least, the 3 flying swords in the case gave him a sense of fullness. Among the swordsmen in the same batch as him, even if he did not consider the sword spirit, his current progress had already surpassed most of them. At this point, he felt that his strength could be considered barely presentable. Cultivation, to be busy and fulfilling, Lu Xiaoyi began to feel that his time was not enough. He could not stop cultivating, that was the foundation. Big Dito to say, which one of them was not to say, not to say, was not to say, Spirit Sword to say, he needed to say, he only to spend a small amount of time to practice to say, to spend a little to say, but he still had a few new techniques. To say, they were not the most time-consuming to say, they to say, these were to say, to be to say, to be to say, to be to be to say, to be to say, to be to be to say to be to say, to be. The 4-season sword required a large number of monster trainers to be able to unleash its full strength. This was his only main flying sword now. If he encountered a life or death situation, he would have to rely on it. Of course, he could not be careless. Ju City also needed to be released and used, to let it familiarize itself with the sword array as quickly as possible, and to achieve as much interaction as possible between human and sword spirit as possible. Hidden fragrance had already begun to inscribe the sword array. This was a painful process for Lu Xiaoyi. This kind of cultivation intensity puzzled someone as unambitious as Lu Xiaoyi. He was very curious. How did he get to this point? How did he go from being a rice worm who only wanted to live a few hundred more years to being a cultivation maniac? He seemed to have found the answer. Being brought to the 5th ring was the beginning of his hardships. In this domain, one was not allowed to be idle. To put it nicely, this place was full of vitality. To put it bluntly, this was the survival of the fittest among bandits. He could not separate himself from the rest of the world and stand aloof from worldly affairs. Lu Xiaoyi comforted himself. His current hardships were for the enjoyment of the future. He only needed to persevere for a few decades and reach the foundation establishment stage. With a few flying swords like the 4-season sword to protect him, then there would be no more worries, right? He was not yet 50 years old. After working hard, he still had at least 100 years of free time. It was still acceptable. A month later, he decided to pay Jiao Lingjun a visit. In terms of interpersonal relationships, Lu Xiaoyi was relatively passive. In principle, he did not like to trouble others, nor did he like others to disturb his peaceful life. However, he sometimes longed for crowds. This was very contradictory. It was the after effect of his soul drifting in the universe for too long. Towards this Jiu-Ling-Jun, other than his yearning for the cultivation environment of the Nine Palaces realm, he still had a certain level of caution. A perfected lord was at such a high level. He was an existence of a completely different world from him. Why would he care about a small ant like him? Was there any special purpose in this? This was what he wanted to be clear about. However, one could not deny everything just because of fear and doubt. He did not dare to try. All opportunities had to be fought for. They had to be actively sought after in the balance of risks and benefits. If a pie fell from the sky, one had to judge whether it would kill someone. With such an attitude, no matter how much luck and opportunity one had, it would not be enough to waste. Therefore, he had to go. He did not think that if Jiu-Ling-Jun really had a plot against him, he could avoid it by hiding outside and not going in. Before going, he specially made a trip to the nearest mortal town for Jiu-Ling-Jun's strange hobby. There was nothing embarrassing about liking to eat orifice meat. There was frequent movement in that place every day, and the meat quality was excellent. If one could tolerate that special taste, it would be especially delicious. Other than the chicken orifice and duck orifice, Lu Xiaoyi had also collected a lot of delicacies from this region, including a lot of braised food. In his mind, these were all the same type of food, so Jiu-Ling-Jun probably wouldn't reject them. He did not eat these things himself. This was a health habit from his previous life. These internal organs were rich in heavy metals and were not good for the human body. However, these health concepts were meaningless to an existence like Jiu-Ling-Jun. Even if he ate poison, what harm could it cause? It was just a hobby, a thought. He did not really want to absorb nutrients from it. He was very careful and didn't enter the realm of 9 palaces from any random place in the dome. In his opinion, although he couldn't see any large-scale formations in the sect, there must be something like this. It was hard to imagine that such a huge sect didn't have a surveillance tool in its own place. Therefore, it was not appropriate to find a random place to disappear. It would be easy to be discovered by high-level cultivators. It was better to run back to the cave abode first. It was better to be careful in a strange world. Chapter 253. Inside the abode, when he read the message talisman, he felt the light and shadow around him, and the space was distorted. A strong force pulled him in, and he couldn't resist. Shouldn't he go in by himself? But now, he seemed a little impatient. He was now in a hilly landscape, and he was standing in a small farmhouse at the bottom of the hill. There were 2 thatched cottages, 1 main room and 1 side room. There was a toilet at the back of the house, a stone roller in front of the house, and a small piece of land that had been crushed by the stone roller. There was also a small pigsty at the side of the house, and a wooden cage that looked like a chicken coop. It was a picturesque scene of the countryside. However, there were no living creatures. There was a chicken coop but no pheasants. There was a pig pen but no swine, and there was a cottage but no people. This picture of the countryside lacked the breath of life. There was no smell of chicken feces or pig feces. The extremely clean environment made people feel a little strange. He didn't feel anything. He was born rich, so he couldn't see the details. Anyway, it was an environment created by Jiu-Ling-Jun. What was the difference? Before he could enter the house, a light and shadow swayed in the sky. The fatty with mixed hair, oh no, Jiu-Ling-Jun, appeared in front of him and glanced at him. It's just a meal. Is it worth a month of preparation? Do you think it will make you poor? It hoped that this kid could come in quickly. Then, it could reveal the cultivation method of its boss to him bit by bit. It had to help him, but it couldn't be too active. It was very difficult. In its opinion, as long as this kid replicated the cultivation process of its former master, it would be no problem for him to succeed. It didn't know much about the secrets of human cultivation, but it always thought that the reason why its master was so successful was because of its early help. It was very confident about this. There were two core secrets of its world of 9 palaces. One was the time ratio, and the other was the space of thunder meteorites. Its former master had worked hard on these two aspects, and finally made a name for himself in the Xianyuan sword sect. However, it did not understand that an individual's cultivation process could not be replicated. It depended on too many aspects, such as the right time, the right place, the right people, the right philosophy, the right choice, and countless other influences. It would definitely help, but to what extent it could help was not up to it. Lu Xiaoyi took out the food that he had bought. There were 2 storage rings in total, because he had estimated Jiao Lingjuan's stomach. One could not use a human's appetite to measure it. I'm just afraid of disturbing you, 9th Master. You're cultivating here alone, but I'm cultivating and releasing my sword here. It's not suitable. Aju accepted the food and was very satisfied. However, he was not satisfied with this little guy's attitude. He was too polite. This was a little illogical. Logically speaking, as 2 very special souls, he, Aju, as an artifact spirit and a sword spirit, should have reached the kind of instinctive and natural closeness that didn't require language or explanation, and the kind that didn't hold back. After all, they had been together for 8,000 years. Even if it was impossible for this kid to awaken anything now, the kind of unreasonable trust that humans could not understand should exist between them. There was no need for a reason. But now, this kid was obviously guarding against him. This was a little strange. However, this situation could not be changed for the time being. They needed to understand each other more before they could let go. More haste, less speed. Humans were very complicated creatures. They were twisted and crooked, and it was not pleasant. You can't disturb me. In the 9 palaces realm, there are thousands of small spaces like this. Even if you tear it down, it won't affect me at all. I say, you brat, are you trying to take advantage of Lord Jiao's weakness and have other motives? Let me tell you, my repayment is to allow you to cultivate here. If you come once, we don't owe each other anything. It's the same even if you come 1,000 times or 10,000 times. Don't think that if you come less I'll owe you. Lu Xiaoyi heard what Jiao Lingjun meant. Was he asking him to come every day and achieve success in cultivation as soon as possible to repay his kindness of exposing Xianyuan? It sounded reasonable, but after thinking about it carefully, there were many suspicious points. Could this be the difference between high-level cultivators and others? To him, cultivating here was only good for him. It was just that he felt uneasy to be helped by others for no reason. If he got along well with others, he knew that he could not refuse other people's requests. This was also his weakness. Was it so easy to owe a debt in the cultivation world? He always thought that it was not a big deal if he did not mention Jiao Lingjuan's dereliction of duty to Xuanyuan's higher-ups. My ability is weak. I may not be able to help you in other aspects, Jiao Lingjun. Aju could also see that this kid was very cautious, so it could not startle him now. This made it very sullen. It could not even mention the time ratio in the thunder meteorite space. It could only let him slowly figure it out himself. Aju rarely came into contact with humans and was unable to communicate with humans. It also understood where its problem was. It was too anxious and wished that it could pour out everything it knew to feel comfortable. So it made the right choice. I've lived for tens of thousands of years. What do I need your help with? I'm going to sleep for about 8 to 10 years. I won't wake up until the next internal and external sword competition. You can come to this place if you want to. It's up to you. After telling him how to leave, it disappeared. This was what a senior should be like. Lu Xiaoyi accepted Jiao Lingjuan's kindness. He had already expressed his attitude. Since Jiao Lingjun still agreed to let him cultivate here, he did not need to bear too much pressure. But he set a red line for himself. Other than cultivating here, he would not accept any other gifts. He soon found the first problem. This was not a good place to cultivate the main cultivation method, the Big Dipper Star Scripture. Because the spiritual opportunity here was self-generated by the 9 palaces realm, He did not know where it came from. But he knew that in the introductory cultivation method guide of the Xianyuan sword sect, many seniors had mentioned the problem of cultivating in secret spaces. He had also participated in many of these internal cultivation meetings, so he had a deep impression of it. The purest spiritual opportunity in the world was the spiritual opportunity of the world. No matter how much spiritual opportunity there was, it contained a trace of the Great Way. Cultivators might not be able to feel it in a short time, but if they cultivated in a secret space isolated from the main world for a long time, their cultivation might progress very quickly. But if they lost this trace of the Great Way, it would be extremely disadvantageous for them to break through to the upper level in the future. It would greatly reduce the success rate of breaking through to the upper level. Therefore, almost every major sect did not recommend their disciples to cultivate in a secret space for a long time. This was the experience of countless cultivation sects over tens of thousands of years. It was authoritative. Lu Xiaoyi did not want to challenge this authority. His talent was in swordsmanship. In other aspects, he was no different from other rookies. Starlight guidance and being with the stars were also not very meaningful to cultivate here. He could feel the existence of the stars more directly in the Nine Palaces realm. But the problem was that once he left the Nine Palaces realm, he would be isolated by the atmosphere. His future battles would be outside, so who would come here to fight with him? No matter how fast he cultivated starlight guidance, he would be back to his original state once he left the Nine Palaces realm. So it was meaningless. Chapter 254. However, there were also things that were suitable for cultivation here, such as the Z-Way celestial form and the star observation transformation. Whether it was the physical strength from the Z-Way celestial form or the mental strength from the star observation transformation, he could bring them out of the realm of Nine Palaces and benefit from it in the outside world. It was helpful to him, but not as much as he imagined. This was in line with the concept of cultivation. How could there be so many advantages for you to take? It was not bad to practice his flying sword here because he could be unbridled and did not need to consider hiding his strength. It was a bit worse in the cavern space. Although his place was very remote, it was still within the dome. It was inevitable that sword cultivators would pass by occasionally. If he was only practicing his cultivation method, it would not be a big deal. However, if he used his sword during the star escape, it would be more eye-catching. His flying sword's attack range was still a bit long, far beyond the range of a normal Foundation establishment cultivator. To him, a more reasonable cultivation arrangement would be to take a few hours out every day to come here to practice swordsmanship, the purple star form, and the star transformation. He would usually arrange for this time to be in the afternoon for a few hours, and then rush back in the evening to continue his cultivation. However, on the third day, he found a problem. The time was wrong. Actually, he felt it on the first day. After practicing swordsmanship for 4 hours in the realm of Nine Palaces, he should have come out at the beginning of the evening. After making some adjustments, he could practice the Big Dipper scripture. However, when he came out, he found that it was the end of the evening. There was a difference of 15 minutes from the time he predicted. Cultivators were very sensitive to time. Each of them was a precise clock. It was basically impossible to make a mistake. Even if there was, it would be a minute difference. It was impossible for there to be a difference of 15 minutes. Therefore, when he entered the realm of Nine Palaces on the second day, he deliberately checked the time. After he entered, he started counting the time and left 4 hours later. In the end, when he came out, he was 15 minutes earlier. If there was nothing wrong with his brain, then the concept of time in the realm of Nine Palaces was different from the outside world. He was a complete layman when it came to time and space. He couldn't be sure if this change in time and space would have any effect on his cultivation. If it didn't it mean that he could practice 15 minutes more than others in a day? Although the difference was small, the meaning was completely different. On the third day, he couldn't bear it anymore. He couldn't be at ease if he didn't ask clearly. "Master Gio, are you still there? Are you asleep?" He didn't yell because he knew that the volume of his voice was meaningless to an existence like Jiao Lingjun. No matter how loud he was, if he didn't want to hear him, even if he was in a good mood, he could still answer him. It would be rude if he was loud. He did not intend to ask more than once. If Jiao Lingjun did not agree, he would choose to leave the Nine Palaces realm and never come back. He Jiao was Jiao, to protect himself to protect himself Jiao himself. Just when he thought that his question had been ignored and was about to leave, a lazy voice sounded, but Jiao Lingjun did not appear. Jiao had already reacted. With his status, he should put on airs. If he did everything himself, people would look down on him. Humans were so cheap. If you were nice to them, they would be suspicious. If you ignored them, they would stick to you. To me? I just finished washing my feet and am about to go to bed. If you have something to say, say it quickly, don't disturb your master's rest. Lu Xiaoyi hurriedly apologized, and then asked, Master Jiao, why do I feel that the flow of time here is different from the time outside? It seems to be slower here. I wonder if I'm mistaken, or if it's a characteristic of the realm of Nine Palaces? Jiao understood immediately. At least she was not too stupid. What do you think? Do you think the cultivation ground provided by the Ninth Elder is that simple? Not only will it bring you closer to the stars, but it will also slow down the flow of time. You will have more time to cultivate than the people outside. Let's put it this way, the realm of Nine Palaces is not within the Five Rings, but follows a certain trajectory in the void. When the realm of Nine Palaces overlaps with the Five Rings, the realm of Nine Palaces will be open for a month, and then it will leave. At the end of the first year, the time will be twice as fast, and the second year will be 3 times as fast. 5 years later, the realm of Nine Palaces will move back, and the time multiplier will decrease. 10 years later, when the time multiplier no longer exists, it will overlap with the Five Rings again, and the realm of Nine Palaces will open. Do you understand what I'm saying? Lu Xiaoyi was a little confused. I don't really understand. Jiao was annoyed. Of course you don't understand. I have controlled the realm of Nine Palaces for tens of thousands of years, but I still don't understand. But it's not a bad thing, it's a great thing. This means that every day, the time in the realm of Nine Palaces will increase. It has been a few days since the opening of the realm of Nine Palaces, so you can only feel the difference of a moment. This difference will become bigger and bigger until 1 year later, 2 hours outside will be 4 hours inside. 5 years later you will cultivate here for 10 hours, which will be equivalent to 2 hours outside. How can anyone enjoy such an advantage? You're lucky to have such an opportunity. If it were someone else, I wouldn't even care about them. I know what you're worried about. Aren't you worried that this change in time and space will affect your cultivation? Let me tell you, the last person who took advantage of the time here became an immortal. Then, whether it's good or bad, do I need to say more? Alright, I'm going to sleep. I can't be bothered with you. The last person who cultivated here became an immortal? This Jiao Lingjun really dared to brag. Did he take him for a fool? If he really became an immortal, he would take him, his benefactor, to the immortal world to enjoy life. Why are you still standing here? Lu Xiaoyi complained in his heart, but he was too embarrassed to say it out loud. It was better to keep such bragging in one's heart and not expose it. Everyone would feel awkward. However, he didn't think that Jiao Lingjun was lying about the time. There was no need for him to exaggerate and slap himself in the face for something that could be verified very soon. As for whether it would affect him or not, he judged that it probably wouldn't. His cultivation methods were all in the main world outside. What he cultivated here was only swordsmanship. They were two completely different concepts. In the cultivation world, there was a fundamental difference between magic and technique. Magic was the foundation, and technique was the surface. As long as a cultivator walked on the right path, it wouldn't affect his future. Thinking about the time in the future, Lu Xiaoyi was really tempted. His current achievement in swordsmanship was that he didn't have enough time to communicate with the sword spirits and nurture them. Now that he had such an opportunity, he wouldn't let it go. However, this way, he would owe Jiu Lingjun a favor. This was something that couldn't be helped. If he had a request one day, he wouldn't be able to get away with it. There was always a trade-off. It was good that he thought it through. Chapter 255. Lu Xiaoyi's cultivation began to get on the right track, on the fast track. Every cultivator had to go through such a process in their growth. In the words of mortals, it was called enlightenment. Entering the Tao was a watershed. It was the difference between sensing qi and being slow, the difference between cultivators and mortals. However, this didn't mean that a cultivator's path would be smooth sailing. The next hurdle was foundation establishment. After succeeding in foundation establishment, many people thought that the next hurdle was naturally Jin Dan, but such thinking was one-sided. In reality, after a cultivator succeeded in foundation establishment, the biggest problem they faced was the problem of direction. How should they walk on their own path? 100 foundation establishment cultivators had 100 paths. Which path belonged to them? What was the most suitable path for them? They should have an accurate judgment. This wasn't just a question of cultivation methods, but also of skills. First, they had to have the means to protect themselves. This was a complicated system. This had nothing to do with whether they joined a sect or not, or whether the sect was strong or weak. The sect would provide them with thousands of choices, but the final decision could only be made by them. If they made the right choice and suited themselves, they would be on the fast track. Even if there were occasional setbacks, it wouldn't change the upward trend of Dafa. If they made the wrong choice, they would bite off more than they could chew, they would be flashy but not practical. If they didn't start from their own point of view, they would strive for the bigger picture. Or if they followed behind others in everything, they would be fated to progress slowly. They would be stuck in a rut for their entire life. It was as if everything went against them, and fate would no longer favor them. In reality, it was the wrong choice of their own Tao direction. Lu Xiaoyi was very opinionated. Ever since he entered Xianyuan, he didn't consider the mainstream as his only choice. This was the reason why the entire star system was established to suit his characteristics. He didn't mindlessly choose the most swordsman system just to become a qualified swordsman. Even if you learned the most swordsman things, you wouldn't become a true swordsman. It wasn't until he found a way to produce a sword spirit and found the most perfect way to inscribe sword formations that it could be said that after 10 years in Xianyuan, he had stepped into his own rhythm in terms of both cultivation methods and skills. If the rhythm was right, everything would go smoothly. Advancing bravely would be a cinch. He was lucky and had his own thoughts. Therefore, all of this was both accidental and inevitable. Would most swordsmen choose the colder star system? Would he continue to wait for changes to appear and insist on not investing a huge amount of mental and physical resources in the engraving of sword formations? If it was someone else, if they realized that their talent in sword formations was not enough, 9 out of 10 of them would work hard on it. If they did not have enough talent, they would work hard to make up for it. They would train hard and throw in resources. In the end, they would be able to reach or even surpass the average standard with their own efforts. However, they would spend a lot of time and resources in this kind of hard work. In the end, they would only be able to reach the average standard and not fall behind. The direction of their efforts was wrong from the very beginning. How much a wooden barrel could hold depended on the shortest piece. Everyone understood this principle, so everyone would fill the shortest piece. But swordsman was not a wooden barrel. Swordsmen were famous in the universe not because they were good at everything, but because they were at the pinnacle of a certain aspect. Swordsmen were like this, and in fact, it was the same for magic cultivators. There was no need to set yourself up according to the mainstream, and then develop yourself within this framework. The correct way to go about it was to first understand your own strengths and where your advantages were, then persevere to expand this advantage. You might not reach the average standard because of your extremes, but once you succeed, you would definitely surpass the average standard and become a top-notch existence. Time in the realm of 9 palaces was just as Jiao Lingjun said. The days were longer than the days before. Now that it was the end of the 3rd year, every 6 hours he spent in the realm of 9 palaces was only 2 hours in the outside world. The benefit this brought him was that the time he spent with the 3 flying swords had greatly increased. As a swordsman, even if he was passionate about swords, he could not spend all his time on practicing swordsmanship. There would always be countless directions that required his attention, such as the main technique that determined his cultivation, supplementary techniques, how to earn resources to support his swords, certain interpersonal relationships, missions assigned by the sect, and so on. Spending 6 to 8 hours a day on swords was already the maximum limit. This was the reality of most swordsmen's cultivation. Lu Shui spent at least 20 hours a day on swords, and this was all done through the realm of 9 palaces. This allowed his usage of flying swords to improve by leaps and bounds. As the only main flying sword, the 4 seasons had already reached a level where he could control it with his thoughts. The communication with the Jiu City Sword Spirit was progressing smoothly, and Lu Xiaoyi estimated that he would soon be able to re-engrave the sword formation with the Jiu City Sword Spirit. The only reason he had not started was because he was a little tight on money. He had already engraved up to the 5th level of the sword formation for the hidden fragrance flying swords. This was practically his limit, and he did not plan to continue. The rest would be completed by the awakening of the sword spirit. Spirit stones were spent like water. The hidden fragrance 5-level sword formation had almost emptied all his savings, and the Jiu City Sword Spirit could not even begin the re-engraving of the sword formation. This was also under the condition that he had the help of the sword spirit. If he were to inscribe sword formations like other sword cultivators, with his aptitude, even if he spent all his fortune on a flying sword, it was hard to say if he could reach the 7th or 8th level. In fact, for a swordsman with his experience, most of them would only have 1 flying sword at their level. If they were greedy, they would not be able to refine even 1. This was not only a matter of time, but also a matter of resources. He received a sword letter from the cigarette box Lingruofen, inviting him to a gathering. However, this time, it was not the small circle from his original world, and there were many other swordsmen as well. The only thing that did not change was that they were all from the Outlands and were in the same faction. This was one of the few invitations from Lingruofeng in the past 10 years. Other than the first time, Lu Xiaoyi had been absent several times. This time, it would not be good for him to be absent again. It was still the same ring-shaped mountain, but there were many people coming and going, and it was very lively. It seemed that Lingruofeng's small group had met many people in the past 10 years. Everyone had gone from being in the dark when they first entered the sect to being able to handle it with ease now. With more than 10 years of experience in the dome, they could probably be considered half a veteran, right? Lu Xi was not the only one who was improving. Everyone was improving. It was still Lingruofeng who came up to him. He was the only one in the group who could still talk to Lu Xi. It was not because they were close, but because of Lingruofeng's temper. He was more like a person who rolled around in the mortal world. He liked this, and he had a natural ability to communicate with people. "Little E, you're here? Come in quickly. There are many friends here today, and some are even experts in the sword. Little E, you should interact with them more. There will be a time when you can help in the future." When 2 people met, it was not good to call each other by their Dharma names. It was awkward. It was better to call each other by their names, and it would make them feel closer. Chapter 256. The last time there were fewer people, it was a barbecue. This time, there were many people, so they did not prepare anything. The cultivators did not care about this. Sema, Bainan, Erong, Xiaoluo, and I went on a mission together. It took us almost 3 years to go back and forth. It was a long journey with countless dangers. We even fought with cultivators from other forces. I have learned a lot. Where did Xiaoyi go? Lu Xiaoyi was about to answer, but Ling Ruofeng continued. The fifth ring is really huge. We didn't even leave the western regions after 3 years. It really makes people speechless. In a few years, when our strength reaches a higher level, we will go out of the western regions to broaden our horizons. Xiaoyi will come too. With everyone looking after him, there won't be any accidents. Lu Xiaoyi smiled and nodded. This was Ling Ruofeng. He did not want to know everything about you. He just wanted you to know about his so-called arduous journey. In fact, it was easy to find out about Lu Xiaoyi's movements in the past 3 years. He just had to ask around in the admission hall. It was just that no one took him seriously. There were tens of thousands of cultivators at the bottom of the dome. It was like a pyramid. Those who stood at the top of the pyramid were always the minority. People like them who had been in the foundation establishment for more than 10 years did not have the qualifications to be ranked in this circle. This was because they had not completely left the foundation stage. Only after 50 years of foundation establishment, when all aspects were fixed and their cultivation had reached the late stage of foundation establishment, would they have the qualifications to challenge the heroes of the dome. Now, they were just swordsmen rookies. Their cultivation and sword skills were insufficient. They did not even have many flying swords in the sword case on their backs. How could they compete with others? Their current circle, to be precise, was the circle of rookies. Most of the people who came today were below 50 years of foundation establishment. Birds of a feather flocked together. In the dome, there were many such circles. For example, the circle of mature swordsmen who had been in the foundation establishment for more than 50 years. What they cared about was completely different from what Ling Ruofeng and the others cared about. There were also the local circles of the fifth ring and with Shou Qingkong's circle. They were only here to entertain themselves. In this small group from the 3 lower realms, the most attractive people were the 3 Kun cultivators, Qi Nerong, Mu Kailing and Tang Xiaoluo. Not all sword cultivators hoped to have a Dao companion, but with such a large base, only a small portion of them needed to come, and it was enough to make this place extraordinarily lively. Everyone had their own plans for the future. No matter where they were, those who practiced hard and abstained from hard work were in the minority. For the majority of people, even if they didn't enjoy themselves while they could, they wouldn't treat themselves unfairly. You would never know which would come first, tomorrow or an accident. Dao companions were the best helpers. They supported each other and encouraged each other. Among all the relationships in the cultivation world, they were one of the stronger ones. If they had a bloodline, they would have more to worry about. It couldn't be said that cultivators were animals that relied on the lower half of their bodies to think, but in the process of cultivation, foundation establishment was indeed the most desirable realm for a Dao companion. There were many reasons. Foundation establishment cultivators were not like mortals, but they were the lowest in all the realms. This meant that their ability to resist the temptations of the outside world was lower, including beauty. Among all the realms, only foundation establishment cultivators could benefit the most from dual cultivation. It was also a standard shortcut. Most importantly, for those cultivators who were keen on leaving behind their bloodline, the foundation establishment stage was the stage with the highest probability. As the realm increased, it would become more difficult for the golden core stage cultivators to pass down their bloodline, not to mention the higher realms. Basically, it was very unlikely for them to give birth to descendants. Therefore, it was understandable that so many cultivators would flaunt their feathers in front of the few Kun cultivators. These sword cultivators who came all hoped that after becoming Dao companions, both parties would have a certain common language. If it was only for the sake of bloodline, there were plenty of earth cultivators from small sects outside. They were gentle, beautiful, and not so fierce. Everyone had their own hobbies. Lu Xiaoyi did not participate in their fight. He just quietly wandered around the periphery, admiring the sparring between the swordsmen and listening to the comments of the talkers. There were constructive things, and there were also childish nonsense. They were all explorations of swordsmanship, and there was no need to laugh at anyone. He had never fought with an external swordsman before. He had never even sparred with them before, and he had already lost interest in this aspect. A flying sword with a sword spirit and a flying sword without a sword spirit were not the same species. If he did not deliberately hide his strength, his foundation would be exposed. However, this was also the reason why he carried hidden fragrance. Cultivating in a low-key manner, doing what he liked, and having the ability to reject all unreasonable requests. This was the state he liked. Swordsmen seeking a Tao companion was not a playbill. They had their own plans for cultivation, and it was a very serious matter. Of course, it was rare for jealousy to occur. What was the point of finding a Tao companion who was not of the same mind as you? They would kill you in minutes during dual cultivation. Every swordsman with their own goals was basically courteous. Not only to the Kuan cultivators, but also to their competitors. What they needed to do was to show the side they were best at. Their demeanor, temperament, style of conversation, and handling matters were to look forward to further contact with the Kuan cultivators in the future. That was all. A pursuer who was hated by everyone would definitely be hated by the Kuan cultivators. Therefore, the circle around the Kuan cultivators only lasted for a short period of time. Everyone quickly shifted their interest to swordsmanship. Xian Yuan 5 rings. In sparring, in conversation, it was also the best way to show that they were different from the rest. In the sparring, swordsmanship was somewhat lackluster. This was because the ones who came down were all foundation establishment cultivators of 1 to 20 years. It was unrealistic to expect them to have outstanding achievements in swordsmanship. Perhaps there were some with extraordinary talent, but these people were basically the same as Lu Xiaoyi. They either refused to come, or silently hid in the crowd. They were very clear that this was not their stage to perform. Their scope was too small. The topics of discussion were not all pleasant. There were also sad things, such as someone who had lost their life in a certain incident, a certain journey, or a certain mission. This happened to almost everyone and was not far away. In the cultivation world, there are all kinds of coincidences that are unimaginable. Fate is always like this. Just like 90 years ago, a group of people from the Blue Sky sect accidentally discovered a secret realm. After some exploration, their gains were unknown. But decades later, the Sentinel cultivators who participated in this Sentinel realm formed Jin Dan one after another. At that time, 7 people entered, and now, 4 of them have successfully formed their gold cores. The remaining 3 are also looking for opportunities to break through. Tell me, what kind of fate is this? One of the cultivators sighed, while the other retorted. That's right. Senior brother, you're just reporting the good news and not the bad news. I also heard of such a strange story. A group of external swordsmen were on a mission in Irai and encountered a storm on the sea. They drifted on the sea for more than 10 years before returning. But in their subsequent cultivation, this group of cultivators encountered accidents one after another. It was either inner demons entering their bodies, mental exhaustion, or the backflow of their magic power. It was as if they encountered some kind of unsolvable curse on the sea. Chapter 257. Cultivators also believed in the mysteries. It was precisely because they came into contact with cultivators that they believed that everything was arranged by fate. Thus, everyone turned their attention to all kinds of strange things, especially the strange things that happened at the Dome and Xuanyuan's sword school. A swordsman said mysteriously, "What you've heard are all legends that happened decades or even centuries ago. I wonder if you've heard of a strange thing that happened recently?" Everyone was curious. The swordsman laughed mischievously and said, "This is a strange thing that happened less than 4 years ago. 4 years ago, most of you here had been in the sect for 10 years and had to accept missions from the sect to travel outside. I believe everyone here has experienced this before, right?" Everyone nodded. This was the rule. Xian Yuan didn't encourage swordsmen to stay in the cave and cultivate painstakingly. Those who cultivated this way would only be cultivation fools and wouldn't be of much use if they encountered a problem. The sect didn't necessarily require their disciples to go out once every few years. In a cultivator's life, only the 10-year threshold of entering the sect was a mandatory requirement. In fact, it was a kind of attitude, telling the disciples what Xuanyuan's style was like. As for the future, everyone could do as they pleased. But if the sect didn't impose a mandatory requirement, would the swordsman just stay in the cave? Regardless of whether it was the local sect of the Fifth Ring sect or the old sect of the Blue Sky sect, those who could enter Xuanyuan's sect were all strong-willed. This was because they started cultivating from a young age with this kind of passion. The only ones who weren't as strong were the foreign disciples. They were abducted, and not everyone was suited to the swordsman's style. But under the overall situation, if you didn't go out, what kind of future would you have by staying in the cave? If you relied on the pitiful benefits of the sect, you might be able to last for a few decades when you first entered the sect. But once your cultivations slowly increased, and the flying sword's demands became more and more demanding, if you didn't go out to look for money, do missions, and hunt for hidden realms, what would you use to support your own cultivation? Forcing cultivators to rush about for the sake of cultivation, training themselves into talents that could withstand critical moments. This was also the strategy that almost every top sect had for their disciples. The sect would only provide the most basic cultivation resources. If they wanted to improve, they had to rush about on their own. However, not everyone accepted the mission and went out to travel. There were also those who stayed in the dome to participate in the inner and outer sword sparring. I think this is a choice that everyone will face. We chose to go out, but some of us chose to stay and fight with the inner sword. One of the swordsmen said unhappily, "There's no difference between the two, right? Although I heard that the battle with the inner sword is very cruel, there is no danger to one's life. However, when we go out, we walk the line between life and death. As far as I know, among this group of brothers who went out, there were quite a few who met with misfortune. From the looks of it, going out requires even greater courage." What he said was both right and wrong. Fighting with the inner sword in the realm of 9 palaces did not put one's life in danger, but the cruel psychological impact was certain. However, if one chose to travel outside and chose to fly at a low altitude or even crawl on the ground, there would be no danger at all. Of all the people present, who would dare to pat their chest and say that they were flying freely in the sky? The swordsman nodded. I didn't say that there was a difference between the two. What I want to say is that something happened in the inner and outer sword sparring this time. In the realm of 9 palaces, where nothing happened for tens of thousands of years, someone actually died. Moreover, it was an inner swordsman. This news was not shocking, and it had been spread around for a long time. However, swordsmen were not very talkative, so most of the cultivators who had just returned from their travels heard about it for the first time. They could not help but perk up their ears. Of course, I won't spread the details, but what I want to say is that luck is a strange thing. It is precisely because nothing happened in the realm of 9 palaces for tens of thousands of years that when people came out, they guessed that the inner and outer sword sparring this time was inauspicious. The most thought-provoking thing was that the series of deaths that followed seemed to prove this point. Seeing that he had attracted everyone's attention, the cultivator smiled mysteriously. 2 years ago, Outer Sword's senior brother Yan-Hu returned home to visit his family. He was ambushed in the southeast region and died. He was one of the Outer Swordsmen who participated in the inner and outer sword sparring. A year and a half ago, Inner Sword's senior brother Yanming went missing while he was exploring a secret. From the soul lamp in the Sword Spirit Hall, it seems that he has met with misfortune. He was also one of the inner swordsmen who participated in the inner and outer sword sparring. A year ago, Outer Sword's senior brother Yensha got into a conflict with someone while he was out on a mission. He was defeated and died, and the murderer is still unknown. He was also one of the participants. Say, don't you think it's strange that 3 of them left in 3 years, and they were all on the list of those who entered the realm of 9 palaces? It's as if they were tainted with evil. Another older swordsman laughed. Junior brother. Every year, you can find countless versions of this rumor in the dome. Do you know how many swordsmen Xianyuan lost last year? 109. How much did they lose in 3 years? More than 300. Don't you think it's too arbitrary to use the deaths of 3 of them to prove that there's some mysterious evil? These numbers can't prove the truth at all. According to your way of thinking, I can name a few places that are even more evil. After all, there are more than 300 cultivators who died. How can we find something in common with them? For example, they all went to a certain place, carried out a certain mission, or had a certain background. For example, you don't know, right? Among the 100 or so swordsmen who died last year, more than half of them were born in the 5th ring. Then, can we say that last year was a disaster year for the natives of the 5th ring? Everyone laughed out loud. That was true. More than 300 people had left in 3 years, but using 3 of them as coincidences was indeed a bit far-fetched. If they were to use this method, they would be able to accumulate countless so-called coincidences. That cultivator was still unconvinced. Senior brother, then why did the visitation hall seal the dossier and not allow others to access the list of those who participated in the inner and outer sword sparring? Isn't it to protect these people? That senior brother laughed. Of course it's to protect them. But it's not the kind of protection you think it is. It's because of the inner sword who died in the 9 Palace realm. Why didn't he save him? Jiu Lingjun was only in charge of safety and would not participate in the sword sparring. The inner sword must have been injured by someone from the same sect. Perhaps it was a vicious attack, and Jiu Lingjun was unable to save him? The sect didn't release the list to protect these participants from the inner sword's revenge. Think about it. Who else could be so vicious other than the outer sword's lineage? If the list was leaked, it would bring endless trouble, so it was kept a secret. Another swordsman interjected. It might not be the work of an outer sword, right? From what I know, that inner sword was quite famous among the newcomers. His strength was something to be proud of. Who could beat him to the point where Jiu Lingjun couldn't save him? From what I see, it's because of the inner sword's infighting that could have caused such a situation. Come. Let's talk about happy things. It's not easy for us to gather, so why bring up such depressing topics? Chapter 258. Lu Xiaoyi listened thoughtfully in a remote corner of the crowd. In his opinion, there really might be something fishy about this, but he couldn't figure it out. Until a gentle voice came from behind him. Senior brother Lu, are you pretending to be a little white rabbit? Lu Xiaoyi turned around and saw a pretty face with a faint smile. It was one of the 4 female cultivators who came with him, Qin Erong. He didn't have any interactions with this woman, and they didn't speak at the gathering more than 10 years ago. He didn't know that this woman looked delicate and cute, and her words were sweet and soft. Why was there a hidden meaning in her words? What did she mean by pretending to be a little white rabbit? He was a little white rabbit, all right? Junior sister Qin, your sudden appearance gave senior brother a fright. I wonder what junior sister means by coming here. I'm stupid, so I don't understand. Qin Erong walked to his side and stood side by side. Although her eyes were looking at the center of the discussion, her words were directed at Lu Xiaoyi alone. Senior brother, you're pretending again. All right, since senior brother doesn't want to show your true face, I'll throw a brick to attract jade. I come from the lower head planet, the same realm as Chao Wendao. Senior brother, you can't have forgotten about Chao Wendao, right? Lu Xiaoyi's eyelids twitched. That I seem to have some impression. Qin Erong smiled. And in Min province, one was Xing Yi, the other was Ming Mu. Senior brother, have you forgotten? They also came from the lower head planet and had friendly relations with Chao Wendao. In the end, one of them really died, while the other died with his eyes wide open. Also, senior brother also participated in the internal and external sword fight 3 years ago, right? Although everyone present was dismissive of it, everyone knew in their hearts that those who dared to fight with the internal sword were all outstanding figures of the external sword. Lu Xiaoyi knew that he couldn't continue pretending. This woman obviously investigated him, but he didn't know what she meant by doing so. He wasn't a spy from another sect, so why would he be afraid of being exposed? He just didn't want to be too high profile, he sighed. Junior Marshall's sister is also from the lower head star like them. Are you speaking up for them? Qin Nerong shook her head. You want to seek justice for them just because they're from the same realm? Lower head star's population is over 100 million. How can I get them all? There would always be discord. Not to mention coming from the same domain, even if they were from the same sect or clan, how could there be a monolithic block of iron? I'm not familiar with them, so this has nothing to do with me. Lu Xiaoyi was a little puzzled. Then, what's the point of junior sister coming here today? Isn't it better for cultivators to keep some things in their hearts? Qin Nerong smiled bitterly. Yes. Cultivators should be shrewd and patient. They should only speak when they really need it. But if I really do speak up at that time, I'm afraid there will only be a transaction, and no friendship. Lu Xiaoyi was silent. That's right. She would only speak when she really needed him. His impression of this woman was that she was a scheming woman. So now, this woman's thoughts were no longer deep? It's difficult to be a cultivator. There are countless obstacles. It's even more difficult to be a female cultivator. There are even more countless troubles. For example, these self-righteous men who think that becoming Tao companions is giving you a chance. They never think about whether we really need it. Since the day the dual cultivation method was invented, in the history of dual cultivation method, was it really fair for both sides? Everyone understood it, but no one said it. Lu Xiaoyi was embarrassed. Qin Nerong understood it very well. He was indeed an outstanding figure who could build the Tao Foundation in a small star zone. His wisdom alone made him feel like he was the only one who was sober when everyone else was drunk. Well, it actually makes sense. Junior sister, you have a deep vision. You're different from others. Qin Nerong said self-mockingly. I'm not the only one who has a deep vision. Instead, every female cultivator could see that all of this was just an act. Everyone has their own path and different choices. Little Butterfly is an inner sword cultivator with a bright future. She is also rarely disturbed in the line of inner sword. She has talent. Little Luo has a persevering temperament. Among us, he is the most hardworking and has the highest achievements. He wants to deal with the difficulties of the cultivation world by himself. Kai Ling is on the path of seducing people with her beauty. It's not an evil path. She just goes with the flow. She hopes to find a Tao companion who can be of great help to her in terms of resources. As for me, I don't have Little Butterfly's talent, Little Luo's perseverance, and Kai Ling's openness. But I have my own advantages. I like to observe people. Lu Shi rubbed his nose. Sure enough, no one who could build the Tao Foundation was simple, especially in the outer zone where the spiritual vigor of heaven and earth was thin. Especially the women here, if they were not special, how could they come here? Ho ho. What else could he say? Say that he was a non-observant object? Qin Nerong said seriously. Although I'm a little scheming to say these things to you now, at least I can leave some feelings for you. If I ask you when I have something to do, I'm afraid there will only be a barefaced deal left. I still want to leave some feelings for you. I also know that you have countless troubles yourself. Who can take care of how much for each other? I'm just thinking that if there comes a day when I can't take it anymore and need help, please don't refuse my occasional help. What I actually like the most is a barefaced deal. Lu Xiaoyi shouted in his heart. The art of verbal communication was brought to the extreme by Qin Nerong. She was very smart. She discovered the uniqueness of this little fellow who came with her from the same batch as her from the clues. He gradually revealed his loftiness without saying anything. When they went out on missions, they only dared to travel in groups. Although they said they were going around the 5 rings, the places they went were actually very limited. They didn't really dare to swagger around. Flying at low altitudes took up most of their time. Unlike this senior brother, who had only joined the sect for 3 years, he dared to go out on his own. Moreover, he could kill strong enemies consecutively. Those were the disciples of the Supreme Sect and the Myriad View Sect. They were existences on the same level as Xian Yuan. They weren't some Tom, Dick, or Harry from small sects. As a woman, she was still somewhat special in some aspects. For example, in order to please her, a certain senior brother who had a position in the sect would occasionally show off his extensive knowledge, coupled with the fact that he could easily kill Chao Wendao, who was somewhat famous in the lower world, before he joined the sect and dared to participate in the cruel internal and external sword competition. The portrait of this senior brother gradually became vivid and lifelike. Even if he was smiling like a little white flower hidden in the crowd right now, she needed to establish a relationship with this kind of person. At the very least, she couldn't break off contact with him. This had nothing to do with whether or not they could become Dao companions. Qi Nerong didn't have such thoughts. Moreover, she also knew that she could see this senior brother's attitude in this regard just by looking at his behavior when he was not in the circle of female cultivators. This was a person with great ambitions. She was very accurate about this. Chapter 259. Lu Xiaoyi was unable to reject her. No one would be able to reject her. She did not ask him to do anything now. She only hinted at the future and was purely trying to befriend him. She was from the same hometown, and she was also a woman. She looked harmless. He was actually very afraid of this kind of woman. He felt that this kind of woman was much more difficult to deal with than Gong Xiaodai, who was a little abnormal and narcissistic. Just as he was feeling depressed, 4 sword lights flew from the sky. Judging from the way they flew, there was 1 outer sword and 3 inner sword. Some cultivators immediately expressed their dissatisfaction. These inner sword trash want to join in the fun. They don't have much resources in the first place, but they still want to join in the fun. The 4 people immediately arrived. The outer sword leading the way was a little embarrassed. No one would give him a good face if he led a wolf into a flock of sheep. However, the relationship between the inner and outer swords of Xianyuan's sword sect was no longer as incompatible as before. It was not the main conflict. It was normal for the inner sword to have outer sword friends and outer sword friends to have inner sword friends. Needless to say, they were brought to this occasion with the intention of getting to know Dao companions. Of course, they would not show it so obviously. They all had their own status and rules. Qi Nerong explained. The 3 people who came are Yen Bo, Yen Miao, and Yen Chang of the inner sword. They came for senior sister Kai Ling. They have a fixed goal and are here to declare their sovereignty. Lu Xiaoyi was very curious. 3 people for 1? Qi Nerong covered her mouth and laughed. Senior brother, you have so many complicated thoughts. It's not as bad as you think. Senior sister Kai Ling originally knew an outstanding inner sword person called Yen Yun. Unfortunately, he died in the 9 Palaces world. This Yen Miao is Yen Yun's junior brother. He should know senior sister from there. When senior brother is gone, it's possible for the junior brother to inherit his will. As for the other 2, one is a junior like us, and the other is an old swordsman. They should be here to help senior brother. Lu Xiaoyi was speechless. Can a will be inherited like this? This junior sister Kai Ling was also a capable person. She could attract so many inner swords. They all had their own ways of living. He knew 2 of them. It was Yen Chang of the 3 inner swords. It was the first inner sword he met in the realm of 9 palaces, the one who was tortured to death by him. However, he didn't know his name at that time. Only now could he match the name to the person. As for the old swordsman, wasn't he the one who had teamed up with him outside of Haloa City? A very cocky person with eyes on his forehead. So his name was Yen Bo, the gathering continued, but with the addition of the 3 internal swordsmen, the topic was more focused on the differences between internal and external swordsmanship. As a swordsman, how could it be satisfying to talk about swordsmanship? Of course, he had to test his skills, especially Smoke Wave, who was the leader. He had to show everyone that he was different from the rest. Of course, he gladly agreed. Fortunately, everyone knew their limits and stopped after a certain amount of fighting, so they didn't really get into a fight. Smoke Wave was most happy to show that the inner swords and outer swords were a family. He was the senior here, so even if he was annoyed, he had to take the lead. The other two inner swords were more reserved. Yen Miao was still alright as he had participated a few times. Only Yen Chang didn't say a word, but his eyes kept glancing at Lu Xiaoyi. Lu Xiaoyi sighed. He knew that Yen Chang was waiting for an opportunity to take revenge on him in the realm of 9 palaces. He was now hesitating, considering whether this was a suitable occasion. It was his habit to not let others control the situation. He would rather take the initiative. Thus, he apologized to Qin Erong and walked towards Yen Chang without leaving a trace. In Qin Erong's eyes, this was especially meaningful. She knew that these two had participated in the competition between internal and external swords. Looking at the situation, it was obvious that these two had met in the realm of 9 palaces. Although the winner and the loser wasn't announced, it was obvious from the situation they were in. This senior brother Lu had hidden very well. Lu Xiaoyi came in front of Yen Chang, who was on guard. The good thing was, because of his identity as an inner sword, there weren't many people around him. Junior brother Yen Chang? I'm your senior brother Yen Chang. Lu Xiaoyi had an affectionate expression on his face. This was for the others to hear, but the following conversation was what he really wanted to say. Yen Chang, you must be thinking of using this opportunity to settle the grudge in the realm of 9 palaces? The problem is this the right occasion? I think that private matters should be settled privately. It's not like you're acting like a monkey for others to see. In this kind of situation, if you lose, you'll be even more embarrassed. If you win, I might expose your performance in the realm of 9 palaces if I'm unhappy. Why bother? If you want to test what you've learned in the past 3 years, you can come to my cave residence. We can compare notes privately, and we can do whatever we want without being influenced by other people's opinions. Isn't that perfect? I don't need to care about your inner sword face and show mercy to you. What do you say? Yen Chang raised his eyebrows. Although he knew that this person was trying to provoke him, he couldn't back down. Well, after this gathering, you and I will find a remote place to have a big fight. You don't need to show mercy. My inner sword lineage can afford to lose to those weird words. Lu Xiaoyi smiled. It's a deal. Without saying anything more, he retreated. Qin Erong, who was beside him, couldn't help but say, Senior brother. Lu Xiaoyi had no choice. This woman was really troublesome. Yes, we agreed to have a drink after the gathering. That's it. Qin Erong was very excited. Do you need someone to pour wine for you? Lu Xiaoyi's face became serious. He didn't believe that this intelligent woman didn't understand what he meant by drinking wine. Therefore, no. You know that when men drink, the most taboo thing is to have women accompanying them. When the time comes, who can drink more and who can drink less? It's originally a simple matter, but it may become complicated. You know, women watching is the source of disaster. Qin Erong certainly understood that this was a battle between the two of them. It wasn't a situation where they stopped at a certain point. They would have to show their real skills. Senior brother, will something happen? Do you need an elder to watch over you? Lu Xiaoyi shook his head. There will only be danger when you meet your match. If it's just guidance, how can there be danger? This wasn't boasting, but a kind of confidence that came from the bottom of his heart. He didn't know how much progress Yen Chang had made in the past 3 years, but no matter how great his progress was, it couldn't be compared to Lu Xiaoyi's rapid progress in swordsmanship. Back then, the 4 Seasons wasn't a real flying sword, but now, it was. At the end of the gathering, both the guests and the host enjoyed themselves. This was a very ordinary gathering at the Dome. It happened every day. Swordsmen from different circles learned, made friends, and expanded their network through this kind of method. Lu Xiaoyi said goodbye to Ling Ruofeng and Qin Erong and returned to the cave residence. He could clearly feel that there was a figure following him closely behind. His divine sense was flickering in and out of existence. He couldn't help but laugh. This ability was far inferior to that stinky Yanbo who was in charge of protecting him when he returned from Minzhou Prefecture. After such a long time, he didn't see that senior brother come over to talk to him. He didn't know if he saw him, he owed him a favor. Chapter 260. When they were still some distance away from the cave, Lu Xiaoyi stopped in the air above the frozen river. He was very familiar with the surroundings. There were no other cave dwellings within a radius of 100 miles. For 2 Foundation establishment cultivators, this was more than enough space for a fight. This time, he did not take the initiative. Instead, he waited passively for his opponent to come within 350 feet of him before allowing his opponent to attack first. He also wanted to know if his defense was effective within the range of the inner sword. In the 9 Palaces realm, he had never come into direct contact with either Yan Chang or Yan Yun. This was because he thought that this kind of battle was uncontrollable for him. At that time, Yan Yun's sword frequency had reached 10 swords per breath. Yan Chang was obviously weaker, only reaching the standard of 5 or 6 swords. This was not a matter of talent, but a lack of practice. When comparing a 10-year-old swordsman to a 10-year-old swordsman, the difference in sword frequency, which could only be improved through practice, was understandable. Even with just the 4 seasons, he could still achieve an impenetrable defense. The 2 figures chased back and forth on the frozen river. Lu Xiaoyi only defended and did not attack. He allowed Yan Chang to attack as much as he liked. During this process, he observed the changes in battle tactics of the inner sword and flying sword. He was slightly disappointed. Perhaps it was because he had not practiced swordsmanship for long. Yan Chang's battle tactics were very limited. He could use shadow sword explosion technique, as well as a few different attribute transformations on his flying sword. However, under the absolute suppression of the 4 seasons, these things could not gain any advantage at all. A battle between a spell cultivator and a swordsman would present very exciting changes in battle techniques. It was a collision between 2 great systems. Exploring the unknown, moving around in traps, and battling heart and strength. However, a battle between 2 swordsmen would often be very boring. This was because the difference in the quality of the flying sword would often determine the direction of the battle. If Lu Xiaoyi's 4 seasons did not give birth to a sword spirit, it would be very difficult for his sword control to reach the level of intercepting 5 or 6 swords in a breath. If he couldn't intercept all of the swords, he could only use evasion techniques or control a second flying sword. This greatly limited his ability to counterattack. But now, the flying sword controlled by a sword spirit could easily intercept all of his opponent's flying swords. Moreover, it was much stronger and completely suppressed his opponent in terms of distance. This kind of battle lost its suspense. The swordsman was completely suppressed by his flying dagger, and it would be extremely difficult for him to rely on any other means to fight back. Yan Chang also wanted to get closer to solve the problem, but Lu Xiaoyi also let him in. After several dozen breaths of time, he had no effect on the sword and could only dejectedly leave. He was a bit desperate. Initially, he thought that after years of hard work, his sword speed and sword frequency had reached new heights, and the only thing he was lacking was the distance he could control his sword. Yet, in a real battle, he felt that the disparity was even more apparent than before. He was not the kind of person who would beg for mercy. His skills were not as good as his opponent's, so there was no point in continuing to struggle. Thus, he sheathed his sword and stood there, overshadowed. Lu Xiaoyi didn't say anything either. Only he could overcome this mental barrier by himself. No one else could persuade him otherwise. "You're asking to be humiliated. Sorry for disturbing you." Yan Chang left, leaving behind a cloud of dust. It was unknown whether he was courageous because of the humiliation, or if he had sunk into depravity. This was something a cultivator had to experience in the process of cultivation. Lu Xiaoyi sighed. He didn't want it to be like this, but who could avoid it when he was in the middle of it? That included him. He had always been hesitant about whether or not he should use the last of his wealth, the 2 spiritual jades, to begin the re-engraving of the sword formation of the sword spirit of the 10 Strikes City. However, he was always reluctant to do so. But now, he had thought it through. It wasn't because he was lamenting about Yan Chang's situation, but because he was worried about the supernatural issues discussed by the external swords. He always felt that this matter was inextricably linked to him. Although he still couldn't determine where the core of the matter was, there was a real sense of urgency that forced him to quicken his steps forward. Lu Xiaoyu was very clear about his position. He was indeed like a crane in a flock of chickens among these inner and outer swordsmen who had built their foundation for more than 10 years. However, he might not necessarily have no opponents among the cultivators who had joined the sect for more than 10 years and had a certain amount of experience. Even cultivators at Yan Yan's level were, strictly speaking, rookies. He couldn't forget that when he walked out of the dome, no one would divide him into those who had been in the sect for more than 10 years. Everyone only had one identity when they left the sect: foundation establishment. Those cultivators who had built their foundation for more than 50 years, or even more than 100 years, were the truly terrifying ones. Regardless of whether it was cultivation or experience, whether it was martial arts or techniques, they all had sufficient time to carefully polish themselves. He had to consider these risks, and not think that he could always mingle in the circle of rookies. Because of his experience with the 4 Seasons sword spirit, he no longer rashly purchased large quantities of precious materials. Instead, he purchased small quantities and waited for the final choice of the Jews City sword spirit. The Jews City sword spirit was different from the 4 Seasons sword spirit. Its choice was 1 layer of speed sword formation and 2 layers of strength Jews City sword formation. After a month, the 10 Strikes City sword technique, which originally had 9 layers of sword formation, was carved to the 7th layer by the sword spirit, and could no longer continue. The 4 Seasons flying sword had 8 layers, and the Jews City sword formation had 7 layers. It sounded very strange, but Lu Xiaoyu knew that in the future, his flying sword formation no longer had much to do with the sword technique itself. What determined the number of flying sword formations was the strength of the sword spirit. And the strength of the sword spirit was closely related to his own cultivation and the time he spent communicating with the flying sword. His external sword technique had already gradually broken away from the trajectory of the Xianyuan sword sect that had lasted for tens of thousands of years, and was beginning to show a style that was completely unique to him. All of this could not be replicated, because no one could create a sword spirit like him. Although he had already found the general method of creating a sword spirit, he had no idea how this could create a sword spirit. He had once gone to the Boa Tower and flipped through countless records regarding the birth of sword spirits, but in the end, he could not find any precedent for the birth of a sword spirit. The birth of only 1 4 Seasons sword spirit could be described as a coincidence, but the birth of the Jews City sword spirit showed that this was not a coincidence, but there must be some kind of internal law. Unfortunately, he knew nothing about it now. He now had 2 main flying swords. In terms of speed and agility, the 4 Seasons sword was faster. In terms of strength and penetration, the Jews City sword was more powerful. This allowed his battle tactics to be in a state of balance. As he had more and more flying swords in the future, there would be more battle tactics to choose from. Just from statistics, with 7 or 8 of these flying swords, the combinations that could be formed were almost endless. This was the true form of a swordsman in his heart. Unknowingly, he had gradually forgotten his dream of cultivating. In the life of a cultivator, there would always be this kind of helplessness. The dreams of youth were always so unrealistic. He wanted to be a scientist, he wanted to be a warrior, he wanted to be a guard at the border, he wanted to be a celebrity with countless fans. In the end, he was still in a small dark room writing novels in his middle age. Chapter 261. While he was familiarizing himself with the 3 flying swords, another year had passed. Lu Xiaoyi's cultivation life was dull and regular. This was the advantage of being in a large sect. When you don't cause trouble, you can completely become invisible among tens of thousands of people. However, some people can never truly become invisible. A sword letter sent him to the visitation hall. It was from the Vice Hall Master Gu Gang. Are there any problems with your recent cultivation? I see that you rarely come to Thousand Elegance Peak. You must know that swordsmen can't be cultivated behind closed doors. Our methods of cultivating qi are not as good as those famous Taoist sections. If you don't sharpen your sword hard through battle, your future achievements will be very difficult. Lu Xiaoyi accepted the advice seriously. He wasn't sure if Master Gu Gang knew that he had participated in the internal and external sword competition many years ago, but he couldn't ask. He could only pretend that he knew. There were tens of thousands of external sword cultivators in Xianyuan, and they could only rely on free-range methods. It was impossible to train them one-on-one, unless you found a master who appreciated your aptitude. There were few internal sword cultivators, so it was relatively easy to find a master. However, there were too many external sword cultivators, so for most ordinary cultivators, it was normal to fumble around alone for a lifetime. Gu Gang looked at this silent disciple and felt that it was a pity. He was an elder who had been present when this person first entered the sect. He knew very well that this little guy was reluctant at the beginning, and would rather learn the Tao than practice the swordsman. However, under the influence of Xuanyuan's environment, he had become a qualified swordsman. However, the sect was unfair to him in many aspects, and this was something that he was very dissatisfied with. The internal strife within the external sword sect was very strong, but he always believed that this kind of strife shouldn't affect the new disciples. They were still growing and had too much to learn. They shouldn't spend too much energy on meaningless internal strife. However, things didn't go according to one's wishes. Even if this disciple wasn't a frivolous person, there were still undeserved disasters that fell on his head. Moreover, they came from the upper echelons. This was the second time he had received an order to deal with this disciple. Of course, it wouldn't be so direct. Instead, it was contained in bits and pieces of the order. The first time was when the cigarette but was rewarded after he killed 4 cultivators from the large sections. The reward was pitifully small, completely not in line with Xuanyuan's tradition. However, this kind of thing had never been explicitly stated, so he couldn't say anything. This was the second time. For this reason, he had specially communicated with the Ascending Hall Master, Senior Brother Gu He. As expected, Senior Brother Gu He avoided the topic as usual. Although he was very reluctant in his heart, there were some words that he had to say. There's a mission. It's about a small city in the far east of the dome's sphere of influence. It's close to the west of the Wolf Ridge. They need someone from Xianyuan to guard that place. You also know that there are countless cities in the western regions. Not every city has a disciple from Xianyuan guarding it. Those cities that belong to other sects' sphere of influence, we also won't casually interfere. However, within the dome's sphere of influence, especially some large cities or strategic points, Xianyuan can't ignore them and let them drift away from our line of sight. This small town is close to the Wolf Ridge. It's an important border town and has always been a place of conflict. The various powers are tangled and complicated. Guarding this place requires a certain amount of strength and experience. So you think I'm suitable? Lu Xiaoyi interjected abruptly. He already had a premonition of the trouble that was about to follow. His heart was dissatisfied, so he abruptly interrupted. Although he had never been to that place and didn't know its specific location, he was very clear about what kind of place the Wolf Ridge was on the map of the western regions. The Wolf Ridge was the most majestic mountain range in the 5 rings. On average, it was 10,000 feet above sea level and stretched across tens of millions of miles. The narrowest part of the mountain range was still tens of thousands of miles wide. To mortals, it was an insurmountable moat. It was the same for Foundation Establishment cultivators. Foundation Establishment cultivators couldn't fly that high. It was also because of the existence of the Wolf Ridge that the 5 rings were divided into 3 large regions: the Western regions, the Southeastern regions, and the Air Sea region. In other words, the town that Gu Gang mentioned, after crossing the Wolf Ridge, was another large region, the Southeastern regions. This was the territory headed by Wushang. Due to the location of the Snow Dome Mountain of the Xianyuan sword faction, it actually didn't have much contact with the Wolf Ridge. But because of this, every town near the Wolf Ridge was guarded by a swordsman. The main purpose was to prevent other powers from infiltrating their territory. Guarding a place like this was much more difficult than guarding an inland city. The overall quality of the cultivators was very high. Not only did they need to have a certain amount of battle strength, they also needed to have enough emotional intelligence to deal with the entanglements of various powers. With Xianyuan as their backer, others wouldn't do anything in the open, but it was easy to dodge an open spear but hard to defend against an arrow in the dark. Some dirty tricks were endless. The chances of the cultivators guarding this place getting into trouble were also much higher than in other places. Of course, the reward for the mission was also much higher. Lu Xiaoyi couldn't understand. This kind of mission had tens of thousands of Foundation establishment cultivators in the Snow Dome Mountain. Why was it given to him, a newbie who had only been in the sect for 15 years? It was very impolite to abruptly interrupt an elder's words, but Gu Gang could understand his feelings. If this mission was given to anyone who had been in the Foundation establishment realm for less than 50 years, they would also be dissatisfied. This was because that place was only suitable for old cultivators who had been in the Foundation establishment realm for more than 50 years. They had to have a deep enough cultivation and enough sword skills to choose from. In fact, before Lu Shi, the swordsman that was sent to guard this place was indeed an old swordsman who had been in the Snow Dome Mountain for more than 50 years. This is the responsibility of the external sword faction. Since the establishment of the Snow Dome sword faction, this has never changed. For tens of thousands of years, our external sword faction has never disappointed the faction. This is the glory of the external sword faction. Glory requires sacrifice, Lu Xiaoyi said indifferently. Gu Gang narrowed his eyes. You're not willing to sacrifice yourself for Xianyuan? Lu Xiaoyi sighed. I've been in the sect for 15 years. I've received free top-notch techniques, top-notch sword skills, and a considerable amount of resources every year. I know that these are not for free. I'll go, but it has nothing to do with sacrifice. There was nothing in this world that could make him sacrifice. Perhaps there was something in the past, but it was already slumbering in its original realm. Gu Gang sighed in his heart. Compared to the native sect and the old sect, these foreign cultivators were still incomparable in terms of loyalty and dedication. This was also the norm for low-level cultivators in Xianyuan. Only when these foreign cultivators had advanced to Jingdan and Yuanying would they slowly become truly loyal to the sect. The last swordsman who guarded this place mysteriously disappeared. From his soul lamp, it seems that he's already dead. Considering that there are many people who are suitable for this mission, the sect has decided to draw lots. You're very unfortunate, but also very lucky. For a true swordsman, pressure and danger are often the motivation for their success. Lu Xiaoyi shook his head. You might as well have just said that you're sending me. Draw lots? Are you lying to a child? Chapter 262. Before Lu Xiaoyi left, Gu Gang said a few words with deep meaning. Young people, it's hard to avoid being a bit hot-blooded. But if you're hot-blooded, you need to know how to make up for it. In the cultivation world, it's hard to survive if you're blindly strong. It's not just Xianyuan, it's the same everywhere. Think about it carefully. Lu Xiaoyi was somewhat baffled. He could understand Gu Gang's meaning, which was that if he said or did something wrong, he had to lower his head and admit defeat. Otherwise, it would be very difficult for him to survive. But the problem was, he didn't feel like he had offended anyone. Speaking of which, when he entered the Xianyuan sword school, he did see a few high-level cultivators. Taoist Qin, who guided him, was one, but there was almost no interaction. How many Taoists were there in the inner sword school? That's not very likely. Why would a rock care about the life and death of an ant? Then there was only one left, Taoist Wenchang from when he first caught the sword pill. Could it be him? It didn't seem like it. Moreover, how could an inner sword Taoist reach so far into the sword Shi rushing heaven pavilion? What was the truth behind it? He was too lazy to think about it. From the day he was taken to the fifth ring, he had no choice but to follow the rules of the cultivation world. Accurately speaking, from the moment he stepped into the cultivation world, he had to abide by the rules of the cultivation world, whether it was good or bad. Lu Xiaoyi's thinking was very simple. No matter how he came to be, he had obtained something in the Xianyuan sword school that he couldn't get anywhere else. It was only right for him to repay it. It was like a transaction. He didn't have any conflict with repaying the sect, but he did have a conflict with others treating him like a fool. Didn't Xianyuan advocate the spirit of martial arts? Shouldn't people fight to get into such a dangerous place? Why did it become drawing straws when it came to him? Lu Xiaoyi calmly walked out of the Ascension Hall. He didn't say anything soft, nor did he refute. Other than a few sarcastic questions, his temper was very swordsman. Gu Gang felt uncomfortable in his heart. He had been in the Ascension Hall for dozens of years, and it wasn't that he hadn't done things that went against his will. However, those were all things that happened for a reason, and it wasn't as inexplicable as this time. Thus, he once again sought out Hall Master Gu He, wanting to clarify things. Gu He sighed. This junior brother of his had such a temper. He was too serious. Take a look. This is a decree from the Soaring Heaven Pavilion. I'm just following orders. If you're still dissatisfied, you can go find the martial uncles of the Soaring Heaven Pavilion to reason with them. This was a red register, and it had a special meaning in the Ascension Hall. Normally, it was kept by the hall master, and no one else was allowed to look at it. However, Gu He and this junior brother of his had been friends for hundreds of years, and their relationship was very close, so there were not so many rules. In each of the top sects of the fifth ring, the existence of spies had never been cut off, and there was no way to investigate. This was because excessively searching one's soul and searching one's memory might reveal some hidden traitors, but it would also harm the majority of innocent people. The gains did not make up for the losses. This was also the method of all the top sections. They were confident that if these traitors continued to wander around the base level, they wouldn't be able to come into contact with any core secrets. If they had the opportunity to become a Jin Dan Yuanying, then they would naturally have a sense of belonging to the sect. If this kind of influence that lasted for hundreds or even thousands of years couldn't overcome the old feelings of a cultivator when he was a child, then there was no need for such a sect to exist. Even so, there were still sects that put an effort in this aspect. This was because even Foundation establishment cultivators had the opportunity to learn about the sect's big movements. It was always better than nothing. This was also one of the main sources of information that the sects gathered about the fifth ring. Of course, they were basically all cultivators with ordinary potential. How stupid would a sect be to send their geniuses to someone else to spy, and in the end become someone else's pillar of support instead of keeping them to nurture themselves? Among all the Foundation establishment cultivators, the fifth ring's local cultivators had the most traitors. This was because everyone was squeezed into the fifth ring, so it was easier for them to infiltrate each other. Next were cultivators from their old home, Blue Sky. The most unlikely were Foundation establishment cultivators from outside the realm. Plundering was full of uncertainty and random, there was simply no way to arrange it. Gu Gang flipped open the register. Among the few red names, he shockingly discovered Cigarette Butt's name. He couldn't help but laugh in anger. Cigarette Butt? Spy. A spy from the outer realms? A spy who entered the sect only thinking about becoming a spell cultivator and didn't conceal anything? A spy who continuously killed tens of thousands of Jinglu cultivators. Gu Gang's reaction was within Gu He's expectations. To him, Carrying out the Sword Chi Soaring Heaven Pavilion's orders was more important than anything else. Moreover, the red names now were not the same as before. There were too many things mixed in here. Personal things were used to achieve their goals through the operation of public tools. Go to Soaring Heaven Pavilion! The answer is there. Lu Xiaoyi once again entered the world of 9 palaces. Since he was going to leave, he had to say goodbye to Jiu Lingjun and casually take all the chicken butts he collected in a mortal town. This disciple has to go on a long trip. The time is uncertain. I specially came to say goodbye to Jiu Lingjun. Thank you for providing the cultivation environment all these years. When this disciple returns one day, I will bring you good wine and food. After waiting quietly for a moment, he heard that there was no movement in the world of 9 palaces. He knew that Jiu Lingjun might have fallen asleep, so he didn't say much and turned to leave. The world of 9 palaces was a very good place to practice swordsmanship, but there were always pros and cons. For swordsmanship, the fastest way to improve was to fight for life and death outside. Blindly practicing on one's own was not enough. What he didn't know was that Aju was in a dilemma in his own space. He didn't know how to choose. In his heart, he secretly scolded this brat for not knowing what was good for him. Going out to blindly wander around without achieving his swordsmanship, he would suffer sooner or later. But after all, he had followed his master for thousands of years. He knew that the little eagle would eventually fly alone, so he tried his best to hold back and not say anything. He hoped that this brat could come back alive. He was just a realm spirit. Although he also had the ability to move freely, he couldn't move without the 5 wild beast limbs. In other words, the higher-ups of Xianyuan would be able to discover his movements immediately. As an existence that had stayed in the dome for tens of thousands of years, his movements would attract too much attention. This was something he didn't want to see. Aja thought about it from left to right. She still felt that she should look at all of this from the perspective of a master. Just like its master from 10,000 years ago, who had turned the world upside down outside and attracted fire countless times, didn't he still walk out? This was the cultivation process of humans. After all, it was different from a realm spirit like him. He could pull a cultivator into the world of 9 palaces from any place in the 5th ring, provided that the cultivator took the initiative to activate the coordinate divine consciousness. But was it really good to do this? A cultivator who knew that he would always have a way out, or a cultivator who knew that every battle could be the last battle? Which one was more beneficial to the growth of a cultivator? Aju decided to let go. He really let go. He didn't force it, nor did he deliberately guide it. He would let this brat choose his own path. Chapter 263. Lu Xiaoyi didn't have much to prepare. All his belongings were in his storage ring. Perhaps preparing more materials of the 5 elements and sword embryos would give him something to do when he was bored while guarding the town. However, he was limited by the fact that he didn't have much money, and the town was within Xuanyuan's sphere of influence. It wasn't too far away, and it wouldn't take too much time to make a trip back. Walking out of the cave, he saw a figure floating in the air. It was Gu Gang. He really went to the Sword Chi Rushing Heaven Pavilion, but as expected, he gained nothing. This was the reason why he came here. He had to make himself feel at ease. I have collected 3 years' worth of resources for you. This is already the maximum number of years I can withdraw. When you go there, don't forget to cultivate. Only cultivation is the foundation of your survival. A storage ring was thrown over. Lu Xiaoyi probed it with his spiritual sense. 300 top-grade spirit stones were neatly arranged. This was equivalent to 3,000 middle-grade spirit stones. 1,000 spirit stones a year, which was much more than the 200 spirit stones a year he stayed in the sect. This was the benefit of going out on dangerous missions. The risk was always proportional to the benefit. Thank you, Martial Uncle. I want to know if there is a limit to guarding a town like this. Gu Gang smiled bitterly. There is no specific rule. In the past, the Xianyuan sword cultivators who were sent to guard the cities were usually old and weak, with little hope of reaching the upper realm. Some of them stayed in the dome to take care of specific matters, just like your senior brother Gu Bei. Some of them were more willing to go out, because it was more beneficial for them to establish their own mortal families. Of course, the time to establish a family cannot be too short. Later, the sect acquiesced to their wishes and gave them as much time as possible instead of a fixed 10 or 20 years. Lu Xiaoyi was startled. This was worse than he had imagined. Until they die of old age? Is this a punishment? For a foundation establishment cultivator who was 50 or 60 years old, this might be a blessing. But for a cultivator who was 40 or 50 years old, this was driving them out of the mainstream where the atmosphere of cultivation was the strongest. In the 100 years when one had the most potential, one would lose the support of the sect. This included various spiritual gatherings, the opportunity to be apprenticed to a master, the sparring between fellow disciples, various competitions, the most up-to-date information, the various secluded exploration teams, and so on. Although in theory, the resources allocated to the sect were not less, or even more, the loss of many things could not be compared to the loss of resources. Actually, Lu Xiaoyi did not care about other things, but he could not go to the Bo-Ao Tower and immerse himself in the sea of books all the time. This was his greatest loss. However, Gu Gang did not directly answer his question. You still have many opportunities to leave that place. For example, the upper realm Jindan? Large-scale rotation within the sect? Are there other people who are fond of that town? Make meritorious contributions? I will keep an eye out for you and inform you of possible opportunities. But you have to understand that in the next 10 or 20 years, it will be very difficult for you to have a chance. You have the right to return to the sect at any time. As long as the place you're guarding doesn't cause any trouble, these are all minor details. The sect won't force you in these aspects. You only need to remember one thing: cultivation is the foundation. As long as you are outstanding enough, anything is possible. If you degrade yourself, then no one can help you. Lu Xiaoyi nodded. He now also knew that the order to transfer him did not come from the Ascension Hall, but from a higher level. The Ascension Hall was nothing more than a relay. It held great authority in the hearts of many low-level foundation establishment cultivators, but in reality, it was nothing more than countless branches of the sword Qi soar to the heavens tower. Gu Gang was a hall master with a sense of responsibility. Unfortunately, his realm was too low and he could not do anything. Are all the cities under Xuanyuan's rule managed by the external swords? Didn't the internal swords say that wherever there is danger they will be there? Now it seems that they don't live up to their name? Gu Gang smiled bitterly. You have too little contact with the internal swords, so you don't understand. They are indeed responsible, but generally, after an accident you are lucky to be alive. If you die, they will avenge you. Their biggest characteristic is that they are not willing to lock themselves in a certain position, because they prefer to come and go freely. Maybe they know that they have made too many enemies, so they are not willing to become fixed targets. Lu Xiaoyi always hit the nail on the head when looking at problems. Gu Gang said solemnly. Don't underestimate the external swords, and don't think that the internal swords should naturally be superior to the external swords. This may be the truth of Xianyuan for tens of thousands of years, but I believe that it will not always be like this. Lu Xiaoyi bade farewell and left. He only partially accepted Gu Gang's words. He did not think highly of the internal swords, but he would not think highly of the external swords either. The only thing he thought highly of was his own sword. With the external sword's current cultivation method, wanting to suppress the internal swords one day was harder than ascending to the heavens. He did not tell anyone about his trip this time. Of course, Lord Jiu was not human. This was his first trip out of the mountain after 12 years, and it had been a long time, so he did not feel anything in his heart. Along the way, he went on a scenic tour. Only when he encountered natural dangers did he use his cultivator's methods to leap over them. This was a relaxing trip, and he liked this kind of journey where there was no time limit. As for what to do when he reached his destination, he would think about it when he got there. From his point of view, the current Five Rings was not in a state of civil war. Everyone was living under the same framework. As long as you did not place too much importance on the name of Xianyuan and protected it in everything, then things would not be too complicated. The worst thing was that everything was done in the name of Xianyuan. The other orthodoxies were all different and had to submit. Overbearing methods would always attract the dissatisfaction of others, and that was how trouble would come. In the three large domains of the Five Rings, there was no weak domain. The western domain was led by Xianyuan, the southeastern domain was led by Supreme, and the Arai domain was led by the three Pure Ones. In terms of the distribution of territories, among the many top powers in the western domain, Xuanyuan's position leaned towards the center and the west. Their sphere of influence, and the natural barrier of the three domains, Wolf Ridge, were very small. The ones that were really close to Wolf Ridge were Jialan and Wanjinglu. The small area was in a relative sense. For the Wolf Ridge that stretched for millions of miles, a few 100,000 miles was indeed very small. However, for a Foundation establishment cultivator, it was very big. If it was big, he could only move around the place he was guarding. It would be a time-consuming and laborious task to go to places that were further away. On the side of the western domain that was close to Wolf Ridge, there were countless big and small towns at the foot of the mountain. Countless ordinary people lived there. Of course, Xianyuan could not leave cultivators to guard all the towns. If he did so, even if he sent out tens of thousands of Foundation establishment cultivators from the dome, it would not be enough for the cities under Xuanyuan's control. Most of the places were maintained by the cultivators of the small sections. They followed Xuanyuan's orders and acted in unison in order to obtain opportunities for their own development. However, in some of the more important locations, Xianyuan swordsmen had to leave people behind. They had a common characteristic, and that was that the Wolf Ridge that they were close to was relatively narrow. It was more suitable for cultivators to travel back and forth. Of course, this was only suitable for the large number of Foundation establishment cultivators. The Wolf Ridge was as narrow as 10,000 miles. It was not a minefield that ordinary people could cross. For Jindan cultivators, this kind of isolation was meaningless. Xianyuan had to use this kind of location as a basis for deploying cultivators. They needed to know the general situation of the foreign cultivators entering and leaving. Chapter 264. Mao Xian Town is such a place. Entering the mountain from here, a straight line distance of 12,000 miles, one can reach another large region, the southeast region. For the Wolf Ridge, which is hundreds of thousands of miles wide, this is like a thin waist. There are many places like this in the long Wolf Ridge, but there are not many in Xuanyuan's sphere of influence. Mao Xian Town is such a place. It can only be called a town, a big town. Because it is close to the Wolf Ridge mountain range, the terrain is rugged and does not have the natural conditions to build a large human city. There are not many people living here, and even if there are people, there is not enough flat land for farming. Lu Xioi carried his conspicuous sword sheath and approached the town in the dusk. What appeared in his eyes was a gathering place that looked like a typical mountainous area. The entire town of Spear Point was sandwiched between two hills at an oblique angle. There were not many flat landforms there, and the shape was like a huge spear point. Below the hills, there was a river that split the town of Spear Point in half, just like a blood groove on the spear point. In terms of feng shui, this kind of terrain is not a good place, but in order to survive, how can mortals care about these empty words? Mao Xian Town is split in half by the river, the South Town and the North Town. The North Town is leaning on a hill. There is a temple called the Wandering Dragon Temple. Behind the South Town is a stone pagoda with only 6 floors, called the Great Virtue Pagoda. His sword case is really too eye-catching. If he hides it, it will be inconvenient to release the flying sword. If he carries it, it is almost telling all the cultivators that he is Xuan Yuan's external sword. Those who have kindness to repay, those who have enmity to take revenge. It is really inconvenient. When a cultivator guards a place, it is different from when an official takes office. There is no entourage, of course there is no welcoming party. They come silently, just like how they leave silently. Cultivators will not participate in the daily management of the town. The town's system is carried out by the local people with prestige. This is also the tradition of the cultivation world, but if a cultivator thinks that this system is not good for the people's lives, he has the right to change it. There was no possibility of Yimao, a local power with deep roots, gathering people to cause chaos, because with the intervention of the power of cultivation, there was no mortal world conspiracy or martial force that could withstand it. The so-called guardian cultivators were actually responsible for supervising cultivators and not mortals. That was their main duty. Lu Xiaoyi glided across the sky above Mao Point town and landed directly on the stone tower. 2 children were squatting on the ground, holding a large blue and white porcelain bowl, enjoying their dinner. The bowl was filled with white rice, green vegetables, tofu, and a piece of meat. The food was not bad. Although it was not sumptuous, it was good in that it was large in quantity and was very economical. Seeing a young Taoist descend from the sky with a familiar sword case on his back, the 2 boys put down their bowls and kowtowed. They knew that Xuan Yuan's master had arrived. Lu Xiaoyi waved his hand, motioning for them to continue eating. He did not blame them for being too polite, nor did he stop them from kowtowing. This is the rule of this world, and cannot be easily changed. On the contrary, it made people feel uneasy. On the bottom floor of the tower, there was a magic array made of stone. It was not very exquisite, but it was simple and solid. The magic array was not only on the first floor, but on every floor. However, the main control array was on the bottom floor. Lu Xiaoyi took out a dozen top-grade spirit stones and placed them in the groove of the array. Then, he took out a special sword talisman and placed it in the center of the array. Suddenly, the array was activated. An array of light came out from the array at the bottom. It was then magnified by the 2nd floor, the 3rd, 4th, and all the way to the 6th floor. A ray of light shot into the sky, and the entire Mao Point town and its surrounding area were clearly visible. If one looked down from the sky, this was not a stone tower, but a building with a sword hilt. And the ray of light from the top of the tower was like the body of a sword, piercing the sky. This was Xuan Yuan's world-suppressing pagoda, or rather, the symbol of Xuan Yuan's sword. In the vast territory of the western regions, as long as it was within Xuan Yuan's sphere of influence, there would be such a huge Xuan Yuan swordsman guarding the important position of Xuan Yuan's sword. It would tell every passer-by, unintentional, unfathomable, and every cultivator, whose territory this was, and who had the final say. Every resident of Mao Point town, every traveler, no matter what they were thinking, as long as they were not blind, they would understand that the light of Xuan Yuan's sword signified the arrival of Xuan Yuan's swordsman. Xian Yuan used this method to tell everyone about Xuan Yuan's existence. And Lu Xiaoyi was the representative of this existence in reality. It was a bit high profile, and over time, he had spent a lot of spirit stones. But this was an official expenditure, and should not be his personal burden. This tower-shaped Xuan Yuan's sword was not only for display, it also had the function of transmitting information. As long as he was willing, he could get in touch with the dome in real time. Of course, in this state, the consumption of spirit stones was exceptionally large. Unless it was an emergency, he could not use it. After finishing what he needed to do, Lu Xiaoyi stepped out of the stone tower. The 2 boys had already finished their dinner, and were respectfully waiting for his reprimand. Don't think that all the boys were poor children. In such a big Mao Point town, there were tens of thousands of people, and there were so many children of suitable age. How could ordinary people have the opportunity to get close to a master? Just by looking at their delicate skin, one could tell that they were not ordinary people. Their duty was to take care of the daily life of the master cultivator. But how could they take care of the daily life of a cultivator? It was nothing more than a pretense, and the daily food was sent up by the real servants. How much could the boys use? Their real intention was to please the master, and then there were countless considerations, such as the future of the children, the status of the elders, and the mediation of disputes. If they did not have a good relationship with the master Xianyuan, how could they sit in the position of power in the mortal world for a long time? He took out 2 low-level spirit stones from the storage ring and gave one to each of them. Then he asked them to do their own things. If they had nothing to do, they could sleep. He did not ask. This made the 2 boys, who had grown up cautious, a little disappointed. They had heard from their elders that the new master would definitely ask them a lot of questions about Mao Zian Town, about the bureaucrats in Mao Zian Town, about the people's livelihood, about the foreign guests, about the disappearance of the previous master, and so on. They had already memorized the answers in advance. It was not a complete lie, but it was inevitable to choose good words to hide bad things. These 2 boys were mature and knew how to talk. After all, many people believed in the words of immature people, and did not believe in the narration of mature people. In the relationship between mortals and cultivators, there were also many key points. For different groups of people to get along harmoniously, they also needed to be attentive. The way to get along, to put it bluntly, was hide your buttocks, and only show your clean face. He even rewarded them, but now, he did not ask them a single question. Could it be that he had walked a long way and was tired? Chapter 265. The 2 boys each held a broom and pretended to be busy. Lu Shi closed the door of the pagoda, went out from the top floor and flew straight to the town. Ordinary people could not stay in the pagoda for long. Too much spiritual vigor was harmful to ordinary people. The 2 of them had a small house beside the pagoda. This was the rule. Lu Xiaoi hovered above the town of Mao Zian, quietly watching this ordinary human town. Smoke rose in spirals and intertwined with the clouds under the high altitude. It was like a fairyland on earth. He had his own way of getting to know a piece of land and people. He also had his own way of living and cultivating in this place. Why should he ask others how to do it? He found a small wine shop. He did not want to go to a big restaurant because his outfit, especially the sword case on his back, was too eye-catching. He had no intention of taking it off. Since he could only be a swordsman, he had to cultivate the habit of carrying the sword case with him at all times. Just like the sword pill of the inner sword was always on standby in the Naiwen Palace. He could not take it off just because it was different, even if he felt it was ugly. This was a small wine shop filled with the smell of sweat and feet and the smell of low-quality liquor. He thought he could be closer to life by doing this, but he was wrong. The person who could throw him into such a place and still be happy and content must be a master. But he was not. Therefore, he walked in the town's night market, which was gradually becoming more prosperous, looking for some snacks to fill his stomach. This feeling was more comfortable than eating in a restaurant. He was not addicted to alcohol, only occasionally. He was not addicted to smoking, although there were plenty of smokers in the dome. He was not addicted to meat either. In fact, his life was somewhat bland, this was a habit. Then he saw the candied hawthorn skewers and remembered his weakness. Under the surprised gaze of the peddler, he bought it together with the straw target. This was a good thing, it could cure his dizziness. The whole night market was a few miles long and was full of peace. There were no thieves, and there was no foul atmosphere. The peddlers were amiable and could not wait to give their goods to the customers for free. The diners refused to accept, and could not wait to give 10 coins for something that was worth 5 coins. Gentle and elegant, modest and polite, as if it was a world of peace and prosperity. He knew that it was all because of the sword case. It was as if there was a strange charm that turned everyone into saints in an instant. Just from this point alone, one could see the character of the previous Xianyuan guard. He hated evil as if it were his enemy. There was no point in continuing to stroll around. When everyone faced you with a mask, even you would feel bored. He really wanted to know, if he came here every day, would he ruin this night market? When he was about to walk out of the night market, he finally met a sincere person. A 7 or 8-year-old girl looked at him with tears in her eyes. She held the woman's hand and cried, "It's him! It's him! He bought all the candied haws on the street!" Lu Xiaoyi awkwardly looked at this gentle woman, dressed as a woman. Because of the change of Xiaohua, it seemed that he could not accurately judge her age, and he was not disgusted to use the means of cultivation. She was young, but there were traces of time flowing in the corners of her eyes. She was middle-aged, but her tight skin was more delicate than a young woman's. She could also be considered a cultivator, but her realm was very low, barely reaching the small success of qi refining. There were many people like her in the mortal world. Because of various reasons, they felt qi, but also because of various reasons, they could not persevere. To be precise, they were just slightly stronger than ordinary people. This, although I bought it, I haven't eaten it yet. Like magic, 2 sticks of candied haws appeared in his hand and stuffed them into the girl's hand, immediately stopping her crying. The woman smiled apologetically. Her speech and behavior showed that she had the demeanor of a big family. She took out 4 coins from her embroidered belt and handed it over. Lu Xiaoyi shook his head, laughed, and turned to leave. This small town at the foot of the mountain also had such a distinguished and outstanding person. Early the next morning, more than 10 people climbed the mountain. Although most of them were old people, they were originally mountain people, so no one paid attention to such a hill. Lu Xi did not go down to welcome them, nor did he go to the town to meet them politely. He sat down and talked to them. As the guarding cultivator of Xianyuan, he must have his own dignity. Being amiable and approachable depended on the situation. When it came to immortal might, many people would fall for it. If you acted like a mortal and made no distinction between living and eating, it would cause some people to lose their respect for you. Instead, it would give rise to some thoughts that they shouldn't have. These people were the people in charge of the town. Lu Xiaoyi was too lazy to distinguish their so-called official positions one by one. He only knew that the leading old man was the chief clerk, then there was the assistant chief clerk, and then there was a mess of Minister of Discussion, Minister of Law, Minister of Merit, Minister of Grain, Minister of Household, Minister of Thieves, Minister of War, and so on. The total population of Maojian town was close to 100,000 people. The town was bigger than the city, so it was not easy for these people to maintain order, laws, and daily operations without any big trouble. Although they looked fat, this was a reality that could not be changed and could not be stopped. In the cultivation world of 5 rings, there was an advantage to being immortal in power. They did not have to worry about war and natural disasters. Therefore, they did not need to recruit too many soldiers, as long as they could maintain the local law and order. In this place, there was no war between mortals because the cultivators would take care of everything. The mountain spirits and water monsters couldn't cause trouble because the cultivators would take care of them. Naturally, natural disasters would be dealt with by the cultivators. Therefore, it was actually quite easy. Of course, there was basically no future for them. Dying of old age was their only destination, so it was understandable that they ate and became fatter. If they did not have any dreams, what else could they do except eat and drink? Chief Shi's surname was Wang, and he was the head of the largest family in the town. This was also the habit of the cultivation world sect to choose a mortal manager. The words of the big families were always more effective, and they had many advantages that the small families could not compare to. This was the reality and could not be ignored. Although the master might not look at it, Chief Shi still ordered people to present the name list of Maojian town, the rule of law, criminals, and other basic things related to the people's livelihood. This was a courtesy, and also a way to show submission. Sure enough, the master did not look at it. It was not only Lu Xiaoyi, but any of the cultivators guarding Maojian town, or other places, or the southeast regions would not look at it. Whoever looked at it was stupid. This was just a kind of ceremony. He talked with everyone for half an hour, mainly about the local conditions and customs of Maojian town. The atmosphere was very good. The locals only picked the good things to talk about, and the master only picked the good things to listen to. It was a happy and harmonious atmosphere. Before leaving, the villagers asked the master to give them a lecture. A group of half-grown old men listening to a young man's lecture was a little funny, but how could they see through a cultivator's age? I don't have much to say, just 2 points. As for the people's livelihood, let's not talk about prosperity. It's not difficult to provide food for the people. There is no need to pay excessive taxes, and it's not suitable if there's a corpse on the street. The rule of law can't be done perfectly, but as long as you remember to leave a way out for people, it's probably not wrong. In short, if you don't make trouble for me, I won't make trouble for you. That's all? Chapter 266. As soon as the mortal bureaucracy left, a second group of visitors quickly followed. The order here was very particular. Mortals were the foundation. In order to show the importance of the sect to mortals, they were the first to come. The second was the Taoist dojo manager of Maojian town. He was a loose cultivator who built his foundation. Because he built his foundation late, he also lost the opportunity to enter a big sect. This person was not interested in small sects and felt that the restrictions were too big, so he came to Maojian town to cultivate Taoist juniors. In any space-time, in any world, education was one of the most profitable businesses. Especially when cultivation was the only way to advance in this world. The best seeds were of course sent to Xianyuan sword sects Taoist palaces in the big cities of the western region. Therefore, the dojos here could be considered as Xuanyuan's peripheral forces in the western region. Since they were tainted with Xuanyuan's name, it was not surprising that they were the second to come to visit. This was Xuanyuan's base in the western region, the source of a huge number of low-level cultivators. The whole system was made up of thousands of dojos scattered in the western region, especially in the big and small towns under Xuanyuan's influence. They were responsible for finding the best seeds of enlightenment, cultivating and leading them to sense the qi. This was the responsibility of the basic dojos. Then, they would send these Taoist children, or qi cultivators, to dozens of big cities under the rule of Xianyuan in the western regions, where they would continue to be trained by the Taoist palace there. Only those who had reached the level of foundation establishment would enter the Xianyuan sect and enter the dome. It was a very obvious 3-level education system. Basically, half of the outstanding seeds in this vast world could be caught in one net. It was impossible to catch all of them in one net. There would always be some who slipped through the net, and there would always be some who yearned for other orthodoxies. This was a lucrative position. Not only did the parents have to offer a lot of education, but Xianyuan would also reward the more qi cultivators sent. The premise was that you had to have the ability to help others. There was more than one dojo in Maojian town, but the dojo masters of the other dojos were only qi refining cultivators and did not have a close relationship with Xianyuan. Therefore, not everyone was qualified to come up to meet Master Xianyuan. The third group of people who came up were Taoists from Yulong Temple, who were also foundation establishment cultivators. Yulong Temple could be said to be the smallest Taoist orthodoxy, which was still a distance away from being a small Taoist sect. In Mao Point town, half of their time was spent on cultivation, and the other half was spent on religious ceremonies. They had actually spent hundreds of years in this half-dead state. Because it stood aloof from worldly affairs and its strength was too weak, it was barely passed down in such a remote place. Sometimes, it could not even gather a Zhuji realm cultivator. However, at this stage, Yulong Temple could breathe a sigh of relief. With 2 Zhuji realm cultivators in the temple, Yulong Temple could be regarded as a very powerful era. The last group of people who came up were 2 Zhuji realm cultivators, who lived in Mao Point town for a long time. This place was ordinary, with no resources and no spiritual stone mine. The purpose of staying here was to do business, waiting for the foreign Juji realm cultivators who crossed the Wolf Ridge. These years, everyone's life was very difficult. There were countless Juji realm cultivators scattered around the 5 ring continents. They also had dreams. If they could not enter a powerful sect, they could only struggle on their own. Doing business to earn resources to subsidize their own cultivation consumption was the choice of most Juji realm cultivators. Crossing the Wolf Ridge was very dangerous, but it was precisely because of the danger that there were great rewards. When cultivators were forced to this point, who would care about the danger? This was also a huge industrial chain. If there were people who specialized in crossing the Wolf Ridge, there would be people who sat on the ground to collect goods. There was a clear division of labor. Those who were used to crossing the mountains might not have the connections to sell and collect goods in the western regions. Similarly, these local merchants might not have the courage to cross the dangerous Wolf Ridge. These 2 Juji realm cultivators were the local merchants in the western regions. They felt that they were more experienced Juji realm cultivators, so they were also qualified to meet the real owner of this land. There were definitely more Juji realm cultivators in Mao Point Town, but there were also those who thought highly of themselves, those who opposed each other, and those who did not want to flatter others. Even if they were as strong as Xian Yuan, it was impossible to make all the cultivators submit to him, even if they were now in Xuan Yuan's sphere of influence. They came and left. The hill regained its tranquility, except for the 2 boys who stuck their heads out of the house and looked around. Lu Xiaoyi began to arrange his own cultivation. He felt that the current Mao Point town was very good, there was nothing to change. He was not a savior, and this place was not in an abyss of suffering. He did have a lot of knowledge from his previous life that could help him here, but to change this town, he had to change the western regions first. To change the western regions, he had to change the entire 5 ring continents. He would only think this way if he was crazy, and the so-called changes he mentioned might not be suitable for this cultivation world. The hill where the stone pagoda was located definitely could not be used for cultivation. This place was too close to the town. Once he used his sword, the whole town would know. For his level of cultivation, how to unleash the full power of the flying sword was the goal that he should work hard for. It was impossible to achieve the so-called "the loudest sound is silent, the elephant is invisible." To the east of Mao Point town was the Wolf Ridge mountain range that was getting higher and higher, thicker and thicker. To the west, it was gradually becoming flatter. In terms of quietness and undisturbed, it was definitely closer to the Wolf Ridge, which was more inaccessible. This was also the direction that he had set for his cultivation. With the mountain range as a barrier, there was a dense forest, and layers upon layers of mountains. There was no need to go too deep into the Wolf Ridge. Just a few dozen miles, and the whistling sound of the flying sword would no longer affect this place. The arrangement of time was very troublesome, and he could not be away from home all day. After all, he was the guarding cultivator of Mao Point town, and not a free person who was purely here to cultivate. Every day, he would cultivate his main technique and some secret techniques on the stone pagoda. From the end of the morning to the end of the afternoon was the time for him to practice his sword, and he would casually bring along the escape technique to practice. His method was to plunge into the Wolf Ridge, and at the same time train his swordsmanship. 8 hours, he had 4 hours to go deep into the Wolf Ridge. This distance was about 600 miles, but this was a theoretical straight-line distance, and was not suitable in the Wolf Ridge. The Wolf Ridge, on average, was more than 10,000 feet above sea level, and there were many places that foundation establishment cultivators could not fly to. There were generally 2 ways for foundation establishment cultivators to fly over the Wolf Ridge. One was to find a low place to take a detour, the other was to fly and climb, which was very tiring. There were demonic beasts in the Wolf Ridge, and since the establishment of the 5th ring, all the major sects had tacitly agreed not to surround and hunt the demonic beasts in the Wolf Ridge. Instead, they allowed the demonic beasts to move freely, and this was also the reason why foundation establishment cultivators could fly over the narrow areas. Courtesy demands reciprocity. the demonic beasts also understood. Lu Shi did not seek to go deep into the Wolf Ridge, and he was not really flying, he was just practicing his sword. He was just trying to familiarize himself with the environment as soon as possible, as there would be a day where he could use it. The first time, he only went less than 300 miles, and after a month, the deepest he went was less than 500 miles. And this was because he was at the edge of the Wolf Ridge, otherwise he would not be able to do it. Chapter 267. When Lu Xiaoyi was outside, the first thing he needed to consider was whether he could slightly hide the group of luck in his sea of consciousness. In the dozens of years since he entered the Tao, he had encountered two cultivators with the same luck. One was Chao Wendao, and the other was Yan Yun. Although he was the victor in the end, the process was extremely thrilling. He didn't want to experience such a situation again. In the presence of the fragment of fate, he was at a disadvantage. The disadvantage was that when he was possessed by the fate, he was still a beginner who knew nothing about cultivation. It took him more than 10 years to rise from a beginner to the Zhuji stage. This time might not be comparable to those peerless geniuses, but it was definitely not bad. He did not know Chao Wendao, so he did not talk about him. Yan Yun had already been a Zhuji stage cultivator for decades when they met. Considering that the fragment of fate was scattered in the universe at the same time, he could come to a conclusion. When Yan Yun was possessed by the fate, she was already a cultivator, and it was very likely that she was already a Zhuji stage cultivator. Then, what if the realm of the cultivator was not just the Zhuji stage when the fragment of fate was possessed? What if the realm of the cultivator was Jin Dan, or even Yuanying? Swallowing his fate was a matter of minutes, there was no suspense. The scene of countless fragments of fate being scattered in the universe was still fresh in his memory. He could even make a basic judgment. The weakest fragment of fate like his was probably limited by his own ability, so it could only be possessed by a beginner like him at that time. However, there were many strong fragments of fate, and they were more likely to be possessed by Zhuji stage cultivators or even Jin Dan, Yuanying, and other cultivators. There was no mistake. The conclusion of this judgment was that among all the owners of the fragments of fate, at least in terms of cultivation, he was the one with the lowest realm. Another judgment was the distribution of the people with fate. In his mother planet, the three lower realms, which was a very small and ordinary star area, he did not meet any people with fate. However, this did not mean that there were none. Perhaps he had never integrated into that circle and had too little contact with them. Even if there were none. However, Chao Wendao immediately appeared in the lower realm next to it. What did this mean? This meant that the number of fragments of providence back then was far beyond his imagination. The collapse of providence he saw in the universe was probably only a part of it. Sure enough, in the fifth ring, in the Xianyuan Dome, he met a second misty cloud. In that case, could there be other carriers of providence here? Considering the fact that the size of the 5 rings was not on the same scale as his home planet, the fact that the 5 rings were flourishing, and the fact that the flourishing of cultivators in the 5 rings was due to the abundance of fate energy, he was certain that while it was hard to say whether there were still people with fate energy in the dome, there definitely were in the 5 rings. And there was more than one. In conclusion, in the 5th ring, there were still several, or even a dozen, cultivators whose cultivation levels were higher than his hiding in the dark, waiting to jump out at any time and take a bite out of other people's luck to strengthen themselves. He had come to the wrong place. If he had stayed on his home planet, he would have been carefree. If he had gone to Chaoguang, the situation would have been under control. Only here, inexplicable opponents were everywhere. Since his battle with Misty Cloud a few years ago, he had realized this point. He had thought of countless ways, but he had not been able to find a practical way, whether it was in the sea of skills in the Boa Tower or some methods he had explored on his own. He had wanted to ask for advice from the person with the highest cultivation level that he had the opportunity to come into contact with, but in the end, he gave up on this idea. After all, he was not familiar with this senior, and he was different from human spirits. Most importantly, no matter how he looked at it, this senior was a little unreliable and unreliable. However, in the past month or so in Wolf Ridge, as he freely flew through the mountains and steep ridges every day, as he unscrupulously shot out flying swords, as he tried his best to reduce the excessively shocking momentum of his flying swords, and as he nurtured his flying swords in his sword sheath, he suddenly had a very daring idea. Could he let the two sword spirits enter his sea of consciousness to help hide the existence of the group of fate energy? There was at least one advantage to doing this, and that was that he could at least communicate with the sword spirits at a closer distance, instead of being separated by a sword box. The reason why swordsmen had to carry a sword box was because they had no other way to communicate with the flying sword 24 hours a day, so they could only do it through the sword box. However, Lu Xiaoyi's flying sword had a sword spirit. Why did the sword spirit always stay in the sword box, and not place it in the sea of consciousness like the inner sword? This was a misconception in his thinking, and it was a habitual cognition. Fortunately, he had realized this point now. The 4 seasons had been with him for more than 10 years, and Zhu Qing had been with him for nearly 5 years. If he considered the time ratio in the 9-palace realm, this time would be even longer. Therefore, communication was not a problem. The problem was that the two sword spirits were a little clumsy when doing this kind of thing. It was an instinct to let them kill people, and there was no need to teach them. However, it was very time-consuming to make them hide. Fortunately, this could be solved with time. 3 months after coming to Maoxian town, the two sword spirits' concealment of the group of fate energy had begun to show results. From Lu Xiaoyi's own observation, the group of fate energy now had a faint trace of, how should he put it, the feeling of a sword pill. It was a fake sword pill. The inside of the body was a ball of fate energy, and it could not be used like the inner sword to scrape out gold essence energy to injure people. Even if it could scrape out gold essence energy, it could only scrape out a trace of fate energy. Using one's own fate energy to injure others? It was hard to say if it could really injure others. But after a battle, if one's own fate energy was as weak as a thread, it was no longer a case of injuring oneself to injure the enemy. He could predict that when the two sword spirits had really adapted to their new job, the group of fate energy would also be truly hidden. Whether Jean Dan's cultivation level of Yuanying would be able to see through it was another matter, but it was impossible for other cultivators of the Foundation establishment stage to discover his secret. The only problem that could not be solved was that if he released the two sword spirits during the battle, the group of fate energy would be immediately exposed. However, since the battle had already started, with his character, he would not stop until one of them was dead, so why should he care about whether or not they were exposed? This was his biggest gain after leaving the dome, all for a useless golden finger. His mood was good, so he flew more smoothly and further away. Then, he saw 2 figures flickering in and out of the mountains, fighting to their heart's content. This place was already close to 300 miles deep into the Wolf Ridge, and the waves of spells could no longer reach Maoxian town. It was also not within the area under Lu Xiaoyi's jurisdiction. In the sky, talismans flew everywhere, spells exploded, and the battle was very lively. Lu Xiaoyi did not go forward, but only watched the battle from a mile away, as if he did not mind watching the show. When he saw the 2 cultivators looking over, he waved his hand. "You guys have fun, I'm just here to watch the show." Chapter 268. He recognized one of the 2 cultivators. It was one of the 2 merchants who had visited him before. The battle between the 2 of them was nothing special. They had been forced to become merchants and cross the Wolf Ridge. One could imagine their background. They didn't have the tactical system of a large sect, a large number of cultivation methods, and a relatively ample amount of time to support them. Their fighting ability was This was also because the two of them had been in the foundation building stage for dozens of years. They had wasted most of their time on how to find enough resources for themselves. In the cultivation world, the question of whose fighting ability was stronger between the disciples of famous sects and the desperate rogue cultivators was no longer a question. A battle of magical powers couldn't be completely resolved by ruthlessness and experience. The higher one's realm was, the more this was the case. The disciples of large sects would have more and more advantages in all aspects. The gap between them would gradually widen to the point that the rogue cultivators would feel despair. This was the current situation in the cultivation world. Because of the conspicuous sword case on his back, the two cultivators in the battle clearly knew who the fellow who was watching the show was. Even if in their eyes he was just a young man who had just entered the foundation building stage and didn't have much strength, the existence behind him was too terrifying in the western regions. He also had the advantage of being the landlord. Therefore, some things had to be clarified. This beast is sitting on the ground to suppress the price and bully others. He doesn't care about the market price. Since he can't make a deal, he actually wants to devour others. Right and wrong, the heavenly Tao will naturally judge. Here, I ask fellow Taoist Xian Yuan to be a witness. This guy is full of nonsense and confuses right and wrong. The market price has its ups and downs, and the price has its ups and downs. How can it be the same? You think you can be arrogant and despotic just because you can cross the Wolf Ridge? Do you think the Western regions is a place where you barbarians can be lawless? The two of them fought and talked, trying to pull justice to their side and pour dirty water on the other. Lu Xiaoyi didn't help either of them. He had made up his mind to watch the show. Neither of them was telling the truth, but neither of them were completely false. When cultivators did business, they often lost their bottom line and only cared about profit. Relying on his familiarity with the situation in the western regions, the one who received the goods at Spear Point Town would definitely deliberately suppress and make things difficult for them. Now, he was even trying to drag Xian Yuan into a fight. His purpose was self-evident. The one who traveled alone through the Wolf Ridge to bring goods had a bad temper. He must have been the one who made the first move when he tried to use force to settle the matter. Otherwise, if he had the intention to force himself on them, he would have used the geographical advantage to find a few more helpers. Why would they be in such a mess right now? Therefore, it was a dog-eat-dog situation. Lu Xiaoyi had already learned not to look at things from the surface. It was nothing more than fighting for benefits. How could there be innocence in a fight for benefits? The more he didn't say anything, the more the two cultivators in the middle of the battle felt. Could it be that this person wanted to use the excuse of watching a good show to finally take advantage of the situation? Based on Xuanyuan's reputation as a swordsman, he was not worthy of this title. But now that the land was vast and the population was sparse, who could say for sure? Lu Xiaoyi realized that he had just watched a battle go awry. That cultivator from the other side of the Wolf Ridge left angrily, while the one from Spear Point Town approached them as if he was familiar with them. A battle without a result. This was also the most common situation in a battle between cultivators. Not every battle had to be decided as the winner or the loser. In many situations, the party who knew that they were no match for the other party would have a lot of chances to escape. And unless the other party had a deep hatred, they would not be willing to take the risk of being bitten back by the other party before death and kill them. This was the norm, in line with the nature of cultivators seeking immortality. Thank you for your help, fellow cultivator. That evil cultivator has always been overbearing. Relying on the fact that he has some skills, he insisted that you buy his goods at a high price. If you don't agree, he would turn hostile. This is not the first time he has done this. In Spear Point Town, it can be said that his notoriety is widespread. Relatively speaking, that cultivator who left was indeed slightly better in all aspects, but in a short period of time, the outcome could not be decided. From this point of view, there was nothing wrong with him thanking Lu Xiaoyi. Since you know that this person's character is not good, why did you come here alone to trade? Lu Xiaoyi asked casually. It was not that he really wanted to know, but it seemed that there was nothing else to say. That cultivator sighed. Who would be willing to come to this barren place to trade? Fellow cultivator, you are new here and do not understand the rules of the trade, so you asked? Most of the people who trade here are not regular customers, so they are very wary of each other. If you ask them to trade at Spear Point Town, they feel that it is not safe, so they can only trade at Spear Point Town, which is a few hundred miles away from the Wolf Ridge. This location allows them to feel at ease, and they can turn around and leave at any time. To us, it is also acceptable that we are not far from Spear Point Town. It is a habit formed over 10,000 years. We will probably wait in this area, and when they come, we will send them a message. Lu Xiaoyi nodded. It was not easy. The so-called landlord could not sit still, and needed to wait in the deep mountains every day, waiting for the guests from afar. After chatting for a while, the two parted ways. The cultivator continued to find a mountain peak to meditate and wait for his source of wealth to come. Lu Xiaoyi continued with his cultivation. He had already discovered that if he wanted to avoid this kind of trouble in the future, he had to avoid this narrowest crossing path. In fact, he had been doing this before, but because he was in a good mood this time, he flew a little more casually. Those who had the courage to cross the Wolf Ridge were all fugitives and troublemakers, and there was no need for them to get involved. The responsibility of guarding Spear Point Town was to maintain the normal order of life of the mortals, and to prevent the infiltration of other large orthodoxies. It was not to hold back 10,000 men. He was just a small foundation establishment. How could he do it? But not long after he flew, he felt that someone was spying on him from the side. His mental strength was different from ordinary people, and he knew this kind of tracking like the back of his hand, but how to do it was very troublesome. You can't kill someone just because they followed you for a moment, right? Fortunately, that person did not make things difficult for him for long. Not long after, a figure approached from the side, and he did not hide himself. Lu Xiaoyi sighed. Sure enough, it was the transmigrator who had stirred up trouble. Fellow Taoist Xianyuan, I am Ming Xiyuan, a rogue cultivator. Because of a dispute in your land, no matter who is right and who is wrong, I still have to explain it clearly to you face to face. This was a smart person, and not only did he have the courage to cross the ridge, he was very clear in his heart that offending one or two merchants was nothing. There were many merchants here, and it was the same no matter who he sold. But Xuanyuan's guardian Taoist could not be offended. That was the real power of the system, and he was a man of his word. If he wanted to walk this path for a long time, he definitely could not leave a bad impression in front of Xuanyuan's disciples. So, in fact, he had not left all this time, but secretly followed. When he saw the two separated, he showed himself. He did not want Xuanyuan's external swords to only listen to one side of the story. Chapter 269. P.S. Today's update is 7 p.m. again. For the sake of Sloth's hard work, please help me with the monthly tickets and subscriptions. The data is average. Maybe Sloth's book is average. But even if it's average, can't he just ask for a ticket? Welcome to Qidian. Sloth will give you a fat ticket. As usual, it was a lot of slander. There was nothing new. But his last piece of slander was full of imagination. This person is not only a traitor, but also a human trafficker. Lu Xiaoyi laughed. Hold on. There must be a limit to exposing people's secrets. You have a conflict of interests. It's not a good idea to give him a death sentence, right? You said he's a human trafficker. Do you have any evidence? Where does he come from? Where does he sell to? What's his purpose? Although human traffickers make a lot of money, it doesn't mean much to cultivators, right? I'm willing to take the risk, but I may not earn as much as I do with you. In the Fifth Ring Road, human trafficking is a capital offense. It's the same for everyone, especially for Xianyuan sword sect, which abhors evil. It was precisely because of this concept that very few sword cultivators would bring back a child with extraordinary talent from a long journey. This was because you could not be sure whether the child was willing to cultivate, and whether the child's parents and family would be willing to send the child away, even if cultivation was the only way to become a top person in the world of the five-ring world. There will always be people who have other ideas. They think it's better for the child to live an ordinary and happy life than to live 100 more years of fighting. This is also the greatness of human beings. No one idea can completely control the entire human world. There are always some people who don't agree with the trend. Usually, they don't think so. But when there is a great disaster, they often preserve enough bloodline because of these dissidents. Therefore, when there are children with outstanding potential, swordsmen often send them to the nearest Taoist temple, and the professionals will be responsible for guiding them and contacting the child's parents and family. They try to put the child's wishes first, the family's opinions second, and the sect's opinions last. There is no such thing as a child who would rather give up the standards they have inherited for tens of thousands of years for his sect. The survival of a sect depends on countless people, countless generations, not one person. This was a very advanced concept. They had done this to the extreme, but Lu Xiaoyi scoffed at this. He felt that this was the hypocrisy of the big sects, not just Xianyuan, but also all the top sects in the Fifth Ring Road. Do you have the time to listen to the wishes of children? Did you ever listen to our opinions when you abducted us? At the end of the day, there was a difference in philosophy. Children and adults were different. This region was different from the outer regions. Just like Lu Xiaoyi, an adult from another realm, he had the least human rights. He was dragged here like an animal, and not only was he not treated fairly, he even had to guard the sect's house. From what Lu Xiaoyi heard, this was probably the most basic human trafficking among the common folk. For example, if a family wanted a boy, or if there was a domestic slave market, or if there was a demand in the brothel market. However, this kind of transaction only earned money in the mortal world, and couldn't be compared to the world of cultivation. Poor shook his head. I don't have any evidence, but I have a hunch. And he wasn't selling ordinary children, he was selling Taoist children. I've said this to Xuanyuan's guardian Taoists many times, but you guys just don't listen. Forget it, I'll just do my duty. Anyway, this is Xuanyuan's territory, there's no need for outsiders to worry about it. He probably sensed the indifference of this young Xianyuan swordsman in front of him. Ming Siyuan also had his own self-esteem. He was an old foundation establishment cultivator for nearly 100 years, and he couldn't lower himself in front of a young man. To be able to do this was already his limit. Therefore, after a few perfunctory words, they parted on bad terms. Taoist children? This involved a lot of things. The benefits involved were also considerable. But the problem was, with such a general sentence, how could he investigate? Where did the Taoist children come from? Where were they sent to? Who was involved in all of this? It was impossible for a merchant to do it. Then was it related to the Taoist school in Maojian town? If it was related to the flow of population, then was it related to the mortal bureaucratic system in Maojian town? This Ming Siyuan was also someone who wished for the world to be in chaos. From what he said, it was obvious that he had told this news to his predecessor. Then, was it because of this that his predecessor mysteriously disappeared? He understood a little. It seemed like there was a force pushing him into a whirlpool. Out of his lazy instincts, his countermeasure was to not go in no matter what. There was too little information, and he couldn't make an accurate judgment. There were too many clues, and it would take too much time. Moreover, he was afraid that he would end up with a thankless result. The most important thing was that since someone wanted him to participate, then if this time didn't work, there would be a next time. The more traps they set, the more he would understand. Of course, he was very clear that other people weren't doing this for Lu Xiaoyi's face. They were only doing this because of the power behind him, Xianyuan. What he played in this was just a role of threading the needle and testing the waters. When the person who could really decide the development of the situation arrived, who would care where he was thrown to? He didn't want to be such an insignificant stone that was thrown around by others. Therefore, he couldn't move. His days returned to calmness, and he still practiced like he did before. Every morning, he would wake up early to practice the Big Dipper scripture, wave his sword, and use the heaven-measuring sword ruler. Then he would turn into a sword and enter the lush mountains of Wolf Ridge. Under the guidance of the starlight, he would attack and withdraw his sword. The 3 flying swords would circle around his body, alternately attacking, or flying out empty, demonstrating different combinations of swordsmanship and searching for the mental state of being one with the sword's spirit. When he came back at night, he would use the Big Dipper scripture to absorb the spiritual opportunity of heaven and earth. Then, under the starry sky, he would begin to practice the Z-Way star form and star observation transformation, as well as being with the stars. Time passed by in abundance, to the point that he almost forgot everything that had happened in the past. Another 3 months passed, and everything was normal. It was so normal that he thought it was normal. This was pretty good. Everyone was relaxed. Mao Zian town was still quiet and peaceful. The adults worked hard to farm, and the children's cheers drifted through the streets and alleys. There were no beggars, nor were there any victims kneeling on the streets to cry out for injustice. It was as if this was heaven under the rule of Xian Yuan. Lu Xiaoyi would go to the night market in the town every few days to get some popularity. He didn't eat or drink, but he liked the feeling of people coming and going around him. This made him feel that he was a human being, and not a monster that had drifted in the universe for countless years. He liked to listen to these noisy and messy noises. The peddlers' cries, the children's cries, the bargaining, the drinking orders. With a stick of sugar-coated haws in his mouth, he carefully licked the traces of sweetness and sourness. He knew that people were afraid of him, so he didn't stay for long. He just walked from one end of the street to the other. Slowly, the townspeople of Mao Zian town got used to this weird person who carried a sword case and licked sugar-coated haws. They were no longer as scared as they were at the beginning. They didn't have any scruples about him in normal business, but of course, they still didn't dare to be presumptuous. When he walked across the long street, a graceful figure blocked his way. Chapter 270. It was the woman who brought her child to the night market when he first came here half a year ago. She was still graceful and elegant, but there was a hint of urgency in her calmness. "Immortal Elder, please wait. I have a request, please forgive me for disturbing you." Lu Xiaoyi looked at the woman calmly. "If it's a matter of the mortal world, you should look for the magistrate or the official." He was not surprised to be called an immortal elder. On this street, except for the ignorant children, everyone knew what the sword box on his back meant. The woman shook her head firmly and stared at him. "No! This is a matter of cultivation, he can't interfere. My little niece has just turned 9 this year, and has already sensed spiritual opportunity in the Pine Tree Dojo. Everyone praises her innate talent and intelligence, and has the potential to cultivate. In the future, when she enters Xian Yuan, she will bring glory to her ancestors and become the pride of the family. Just last month, the dojo sent the children to the nearest big city, Linxia City. If everything goes well, the children will grow up there and eventually join a sect." Lu Xiaoyi smiled bitterly as he listened. How could it be so easy to join a sect? Which child's family did not think that their child was the best in the world? In the end, they were still disappointed. Out of 10, not even 1 could get what they wanted. This woman did not understand these things, so he did not expose her. Meitzen family's ancestors were cultivators, but they declined after a few generations. However, my family still has a treasure passed down from generation to generation. It is called the needle of fixing shadow. It is divided into a needle and a jade pendant. If someone wears the jade pendant, then the needle of fixing shadow will always point in the direction of the jade pendant. It has never been wrong. Warner is the last of my Tson family's bloodline. Before I left, I gave her the jade pendant. It was not because I suspected anything, but because I could see where the needle was pointing. My heart felt a trace of longing. Although I am a woman and do not have much knowledge, but word of mouth in the town said that every year, children were sent to Linxia City. Everyone bowed towards the northwest, so I knew that Linxia City was in the northwest direction. But who would have thought that my family's fixing needle would point to the south of the southwest? This direction is too different. I don't understand and am afraid that my child will be sent to some unknown dangerous place. Therefore, I risked my life to stop Master Immortal and ask Master Immortal to uphold justice for this humble girl. Lu Xiui sighed in his heart. He didn't expect that he would fall into the trap in such a natural way. The person behind this was very skilled. Although it was a little old-fashioned, it didn't leave any traces. He couldn't ignore it anymore. Because this was related to the foundation of the Western region's cultivation world. What's your name? Where do you live? Sinyusher, a widow, lives in a small willow alley in a side street. She and her niece, Xiaowan, depend on each other. Did you inform the owner of Ru Song Dojo, Southern Taoist? Never. Although this little girl's experience is shallow, her family's fortune has declined. Over the years, she has become accustomed to the fickleness of human nature. Since the people who were sent away were sent by the dojo, how could they not know where they were going? If this little girl were to casually ask about it, who knows what kind of accident would happen? I have no relatives or friends here who would care about me. Therefore, I could only wait here every day for the immortal master to appear. Only you, a newcomer to Maozian town, would not be in cahoots with them. Lu Xiaoyi sighed again. There were no fools, even if they were mortals who didn't know how to cultivate. How many days ago was this? Sinyusher clearly remembered it very clearly. 17 days and another 8 hours. At that time, when the carriage first set out, because the mountain road was winding and the direction was not fixed, this little girl didn't have any suspicions in the first 5 or 6 days. But after 7 or 8 days, the direction became more and more deviated. Only then did I start to panic. Every day, I just prayed that I was not familiar with the road. What if they took a shortcut? But after 10 days, I already knew that something was wrong. It was impossible to travel for so long in the opposite direction. I heard them say that Linxia City was only a month's journey. How could it be possible that after 10 days of travel, the direction was still deviated? After that, this little girl waited in the night market every day, hoping to see the immortal master. I hope that this was just a misunderstanding caused by this little girl's ignorance. Lu Xiaoyi stretched out his hand. Let me see the needle plate. Sinyusher took out a small, palm-sized iron plate from her sleeve and handed it over. It was obvious that she had prepared it for a long time. Lu Xiaoyi took it in his hand. He could feel the faint spiritual energy fluctuation on it. Looking at the material, it was probably very old. After that, he didn't know anything. It wasn't that he wasn't good at making weapons, it was that he didn't know how to make weapons at all. His talent in this aspect was bleak, and he didn't have the slightest desire to change. But he still pretended to fiddle with it a few times, appearing very experienced. It couldn't be helped. She had already called him an immortal master. He couldn't be like a fool who didn't know anything and only knew how to release flying swords, right? He had his own weakness. Others couldn't see it. In front of those young female cultivators who looked young, such as the 4 beautiful female cultivators who came with him, he could act cold and hard like a stone, without any fluctuations in his heart. But in front of this kind of woman who had the vestiges of time, experience and charm, only then would there be a little ripple. Although he was actually much older than this woman, when humans started to cultivate, the issue of age was messed up. A person who was almost 50 years old still considered himself young. This was a relatively normal mentality. I will handle this matter. You don't have to worry about her safety. No matter where she is sent, she will be learning Tao and cultivating Qi. She will be at the stage of building up her foundation and knowledge. When there is definite news, I will pay her a visit. Sinyusher bowed deeply. Her thin clothes were tight and set off her master's beautiful figure, causing people to have wild and fanciful thoughts. There are many people in Little Willow Alley. It's rather messy. I will light ambergris in the courtyard and wait for the immortal master's arrival. Lu Xiaoyi smiled and said carelessly, It must cost a lot to send a child to the Taoist hall, right? The woman sighed. My family declined, and I drifted away to seek refuge with my relatives. But I didn't expect to have the fate of a jinx. My brother and sister-in-law passed away 2 years ago. I had some extra money, but I didn't dare to show it. I was afraid that people would be jealous of me, so I could only put it all on the child. This was the only thing that no one dared to think about, but I didn't expect. Lu Xiaoyi nodded and strode towards the town. That was the direction of Ru Song Taoist Hall. As for how to deal with this trouble, he chose the simplest method, which was to face it directly. He had Xianyuan as his backer, so there was no need for him to carefully seek confirmation and grasp clues. They were all children, and there were quite a number of them. If he started with the children, there would be more trouble. He had the style of a lazy person, and he also felt that doing so would reduce the number of detours. The Taoist hall's allocation of Tao children had always been their own secret. In Xuanyuan's territory, they allocated more Tao children to the Taoist palace that belonged to Xianyuan. It did not mean that they could not provide Tao children to other sections. There would always be relationships between people, situations where there was no other choice, benefits, and the Taoist child's own wishes. In other words, although Tsinyusher heard that her niece was sent to the Xianyuan Tao Palace in Linxia City, this kind of thing could not be confirmed. The other party had countless reasons to brush her off. Therefore, the key was the method of doing things. Chapter 271. The Rusong Taoist School was located on the ridge of the spear. It had its own gate and courtyard and was very imposing. As an educator, one had to put on airs. If one built a shabby house with broken tiles, people would doubt one's strength and would not send their children here. It was already past the time for evening classes. Now, the Taoist children were free to do whatever they wanted. Those who were more diligent were studying, while those who were lazy had already fallen asleep. Of course, children at this age were the most sleepy, so there were more people in their dreams. Cultivators had their own safety zone. The higher the cultivation level, the bigger the safety zone. Therefore, it was impossible to see two upper cultivators with their arms around each other's shoulders. This was against the basic knowledge of cultivation. Of course, foundation establishment cultivators also had their own safety distance. In open areas, they would be further away, and in busy cities, they would be closer. Basically, the distance was determined by the attack range of cultivators of the same level. For example, for ordinary foundation establishment cultivators, several thousand feet was the limit of their flying swords. Therefore, if they were strangers to each other, they would have to maintain this distance. This was the most basic etiquette of cultivators, and also the most basic precaution. This distance would be greatly reduced in places where mortals gathered, because you could not only consider your own safety zone. Everyone had the right to move freely. Since you were in a busy city, you had to agree to this change. In a busy city, the fluctuation of strange spiritual vigor should not be closer than hundreds of feet, depending on the situation. Taoist Nan was in the Rusong Taoist school, and hundreds of feet was his limit. This also meant that if Lu Xiaoyi wanted to talk to him, there would be a difference between a civil conversation and a martial one. In the Rusong Taoist school, Taoist Nan was in a quiet room, but he was not meditating. In front of him were some spirit stones and tools, which were obtained from this trip of transporting Taoist children. He was already 170 years old. For a foundation establishment cultivator at this age, this was a very important juncture. Once a cultivator was over 200 years old, their body functions would begin to decline, and it was basically impossible for them to form their gold essence. Therefore, before they were 200 years old was their last chance. If they were slightly ahead of time, he was basically at the end of his life now. It was precisely because of this kind of pressure that in recent years, his mentality of earning resources had become more urgent. Originally, he had been well behaved, but now, he had begun to act out of line. It was all because he was forced to. He couldn't just walk step by step towards death, right? There were many resources needed to form one's gold core, such as great medicines, tools, and some special supplements. They were all very valuable and sought-after goods. The group of cultivators with the highest number of fifth-ring cultivators were at the foundation establishment realm. After 100 years of accumulation, they had all accumulated some wealth. Therefore, the amount of resources needed to form one's gold core had increased exponentially. Over the past 10,000 years, the amount of resources needed to form one's gold core had never decreased. Instead, it had steadily increased every year, causing people to panic. He could be considered to have a fixed income. He had obtained a certain amount of wealth from the Taoist children of Xianyuan Sword School and the surrounding sects, large and small. He didn't need to do the hard work of crossing the Wolf Ridge. Over the past several decades, he had accumulated about 70 to 80% of what he needed to form his gold core. In a few more years he would be ready. At that time, it would be time to decide his future. However, it was also because of this that he was very biased in his cultivation. Basically, he focused on the cultivation method as his main cultivation direction. As for other aspects, such as fighting, he rarely dabbled in them because he didn't have the time. Not everyone could open a Taoist school, and not everyone could establish a relationship with the Xianyuan Sword School. At the very least, you had to have an advantage, a higher success rate than other schools. Only with a higher success rate could parents send their children to the school. Only then could there be more students. Only then could more Taoist children be cultivated. Only then could the school be recognized by the Taoist palace of the major sections. Only then could the school be rewarded handsomely based on the number of Taoist children sent to the school. This was a virtuous cycle, and also the key to his accumulation of spirit stones. In Maojian Town, he had a higher success rate than other Taoist schools. This wasn't luck, but it required a lot of time and effort. He needed to understand each child's aptitude, mentality, temperament, and so on. Then, according to each child's difference, he could formulate a different chi sensing and channeling plan. Without effort, how could there be gains? His talent in fighting was limited, but he had a lot of experience in helping others to sense chi. It was also like a chicken peeing, everyone had their own way. This was the sorrow of a rogue cultivator. He was already too old when he built his foundation, and wasn't accepted by the major sections. Otherwise, his current situation would undoubtedly be much better. Quietly looking at the spirit stones on the table in front of him, he constantly pondered in his heart how much he still lacked, which market to buy from in order to save a few precious spirit stones, and how many Taoist children he still needed to send to make up for this last hole. Also, all these years, would he attract the attention of the Xianyuan sect? Slowly, the pile of spirit stones in front of him seemed to turn into a flying sword, showing off its sharpness and threatening coldness. This wasn't right. A foundation establishment cultivator shouldn't have this kind of hallucination occasionally in his reverie. Someone was taking advantage of his mental state when he was unprepared, and was invading his mind. His mana surged, and his spirit shook. In an instant he woke up from his absent-mindedness. How could he make another move in time? A flying sword was quietly fixed in front of his chest, the tip of the sword faintly touching his robes. A sharp aura faintly seeped out, and he could clearly feel it on his skin. A chill rose from the bottom of his heart. He couldn't move, so he could only open his mouth. Fellow Taoist Yen, why are you doing this? Which rule of Xianyuan have I broken? A figure floated in from outside, but it didn't have the slightest bit of the sharp aura of a swordsman who wielded a sword. Instead, it was very natural and unrestrained, without a trace of anger. If it wasn't for the flying sword against his chest, the Southern Taoist would have thought that it was a famous Dharma cultivator. Gradually, the figure became clear. It was indeed the new Xianyuan guard who kept a low profile. What he didn't expect was that this swordsman who looked so young, and in fact was very young, would make a move. He, an old Foundation establishment cultivator who was almost 200 years old, couldn't even struggle in his hands. For a moment, all his thoughts were put to rest. I came here to investigate the disappearance of Senior Brother Guanggu, and also to investigate the recent illegal transportation of Dao children in Maozian town. Therefore, I have some questions to ask fellow Taoist Nan. I have no other choice, so please don't blame me for being rude. The Southern Taoist was just about to cry out for injustice. But who knew that the flying sword would gently push forward, as if it would pierce through his body in the next moment. He quickly shut his mouth. It's not a big matter, it happens in the western regions every day. But to me, if I don't handle it well, it will affect the sex evaluation. Therefore, it's a big matter to me. Lu Xiaoyi didn't have the slightest hesitation in using Xianyuan as a banner. The simplest and most convenient way is to find a scapegoat. You Southern Taoist Nan are unruly and have no background. In my eyes, you're the best scapegoat. As for the truth, who cares? Chapter 272. The Southern priest wanted to move, but the flying sword made him lose all his thoughts. No matter how hard he tried, he would not be able to react faster than the flying sword. Lu Xiaoyi was still going on. He had to create a facade that he was in control of the situation, and that he came here with Xuanyuan's secret order. Although he might have been demoted, it was an internal matter of Xianyuan. It was impossible for the people in Maozian town to know about it. All of this was to find out the truth as soon as possible, not to waste time on lies. The lies of these local bullies would be endless from the beginning, making you waste a lot of time on seeking confirmation. If he really came here with a mission, it would be fine if he had his own helpers. But now he was alone, how could he have the time to go around seeking confirmation? He hated guarding missions because it had already deviated from the principles of a cultivator. He had to consider too many other aspects, such as the feelings of the ordinary people, the feelings of the local cultivators, the feelings of the merchants, and the transmigrators coming from the opposite side. It would be best to kill decisively and make the final decision, but he might not have the ability to do so. What he saw now was only the power of the cultivators on the surface of Maozian town. He did not know what was under the surface. The worst thing was that he had lost the swordsman's advantage. He could not just kill and leave, but he had to stay here for a long time. If he acted too violently, there would be endless revenge until the day he could not stand it anymore. So, in order to not be violent in the future, he had to pretend to be violent now. But I am still willing to give you a chance. Because I was also a rogue cultivator before I came to Xianyuan. I know the difficulties of being a rogue cultivator. There are some things that you will never have the chance to do if you don't take risks. But I don't really want to do something to overthrow Xuanyuan's position in the western region. He could not blindly be tough and cold-blooded. He had to be gentle occasionally. He could not force the southern priest into a corner. Otherwise, what difference would it make whether he spoke or not? Just as southern priest was about to respond, he was forced back by the flying sword. He could tell that if the swordsman didn't want him to speak, he couldn't speak. Judging from his personality, he was a typical swordsman who was self-centered and didn't care about the consequences. This kind of person is easy to deal with, as long as you tell the truth. However, this kind of person is also not easy to deal with, because if you make him unhappy, he may not reason with you and directly use violence. The prerequisite is that you have to tell me what you know. You don't want me to guess and ask you a question and you answer it. You can't judge from your point of view what should be said and what shouldn't be said. This is my right. What I can promise you is that as long as it doesn't involve matters of principle, I can pretend that I didn't see anything. After all, some things are common in the Western regions and the Fifth Ring. Even if I find you, I won't be able to change the overall situation. My patience is limited and I can only listen to you once, so you'd better cherish this opportunity. The southern priest felt his body lighten, and the flying sword disappeared. He could now use any means to fight back, but he didn't have the courage to do so. He had lost his mind. So what if he fought back? Would he be able to beat this swordsman? Would he be able to outrun this swordsman? Would he be able to escape Xuan Yuan's pursuit after today? Would he give up the resources he had accumulated for most of his life without even trying to form his Azoth core? What was he after? Thus, he smiled bitterly. Of the two things you mentioned, I really don't know the truth about the disappearance of the previous guardian of the Light Valley. I haven't even heard of any related news. As a loose cultivator in the western regions, I rely on sending Taoist children to Xianyuan to make a living. Anyone with a bit of intelligence would know what to do and what not to do. As for the second thing, I admit that I messed up the delivery of Taoist children. In order to obtain more resources, I tampered with both the delivery and receipt. Lu Xiaoyi listened quietly and didn't interrupt. Mao Xian town has a population of nearly 100,000. Every year, there are thousands of children of the right age to learn Taoist skills. Among them, there are less than 100 who can afford to pay for their education. The ones who are sent to Pine Tree Dojo are around 100. In the end, those who can really sense qi are around 20 to 30 people. I also rely on these Taoist children to collect spirit stones from various sections. Lu Xiaoyi nodded. This was the structure of the basic cultivation system in the western regions. Not only in the western regions, but also in the other two regions. The Fifth Ring was too big, and there were countless towns and cities. It was impossible for a sect to control every town and city. It was time-consuming and laborious, so it was better to let loose cultivators who were in urgent need of resources to do this. Of course, if you do this kind of basic cultivation in my territory, you have to ensure that the Taoist children are supplied to the sect that controls it first. You can't let the fertile water flow to other people's fields. There were many things that could be manipulated. For example, in theory, the Taoist children had the right to choose their own orthodoxy. This right was even above who controlled the area. This was the so-called freedom of the great Tao and the flow of talents in the cultivation world. For a sect, if the local Taoist children all had the freedom of the great Tao, they would definitely not be willing to do so. Therefore, the way the Taoist dojo educated them was very important. The Taoist children were still young and did not have a clear direction in their cultivation. If the Taoist dojo master instilled Xuanyuan's good Xuanyuan's wonderful Xuanyuan's swordsmanship every day, then of course, most of them would choose to go to Xianyuan, and vice versa. For the Taoist dojo master, there were many factors that would affect his choice. For example, in Mao Xian town, he had to first consider sending the Taoist children to Xuanyuan's Taoist palace. Because this was the western regions, Xuanyuan's territory. Secondly, he had to consider which sect was willing to pay a higher price. There were always small and medium-sized sects that needed more fresh blood because of the issue of inheritance. Therefore, they would pay a higher price. For example, in his previous life, the key universities had no lack of students because of their reputation and attractiveness. However, those second- and third-rate schools could only think of other ways. Throwing in spiritual stones was the fastest and most direct method. A smart Taoist dojo master would find a balance. Not only could he not offend the local big sects, he also had to earn some extra income from other places. There was room for manipulation. It all depended on the Taoist dojo master's courage, whether he was in urgent need of spiritual stones, etc. In the past, most of the Taoist children were sent to Xianyuan from Mao Xian town. A few were sent to other places. This was also the rule of Xianyuan in the western regions. However, in recent years, as I grew older, I felt that I didn't have much time left, and the accumulation of resources was far from enough. Therefore, in the past 10 years, the ratio slowly changed. It became a situation where half of the Taoist children were sent to Xianyuan and half to other places. This was because I wanted to quickly accumulate resources. This was my fault. The behavior of the Southern Taoists was not an isolated phenomenon. It was a common occurrence and an open secret. It was the main way for the Taoist dojo masters to earn some extra income. Lu Xiaoyu was actually most worried that he would ask such a trivial question. Should he investigate or not? What a headache! You're tuning into the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.